right, we can get started. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you so much to the panelists for being here. Welcome to the third of four weeks of the Seed Bootcamp at Allraise. And as a quick recap, the last couple of weeks we focused on how to know if you have product market fit, how to find it more quickly, when to fundraise, different ways to fund your company, basics of investment terms, how to run a seed process and get introductions to investors. And today we're going to focus on how to make a great investor blurb, a great pitch deck, and then how to answer questions from investors. And as usual, we'll start with intros from the panel, and then I'll ask a handful of questions that go along with those topics, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A, and I'll surface questions that people are asking. If we could start with the panel, each introducing yourself, and just say your name and the company or fund that you're at, or if you've been a founder and an investor, as both of our investors have. And then like what your company does, the size of the company, and how much you've raised. So I can do an example. So I'm Felicia. I'm the co-founder CEO of Ebitda. We build software to improve the foster care system. We're 36 people, and we've raised $14 million. Haley, do you want to go?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Barna. I'm a partner at Frowned Capital. I'm based in our New York office. I took a disco nap to make sure that I could stay up late with you all tonight. And Frowned is a seed stage venture capital fund. So we fund companies at the earliest stages, including Felicia's company, Ebitda. We're proud investors there. Prior to joining Frowned Capital, I was a founder that Frowned backed. So I co-founded a company called Birchbox back in 2010, raised a seed round. Miraculously, we weren't very good at the seed fundraising process, but then we got very good at fundraising after that. And so during my tenure at Birchbox, we raised over $70 million through the Series B.
Awesome. And I just want to say thank you so much for Haley joining. If you don't mind sharing that you're pregnant, and you're 8 months pregnant, and would normally go to bed earlier than.
For anyone who's been 8 months pregnant, I haven't been sleeping that well. So I told Felicia, I was like, my bedtime's been early. I'm going to try to make it till 11 p.m. But I feel like having 200 people logged into this, like there's so much energy. I'm going to rise to the challenge. It won't be a problem at all.
Thank you so much. It's a real commitment.
For having me.
Holly, do you want to go?
Sure. So I guess I'll go. I'm currently a visiting partner at Y Combinator. For those that are unfamiliar, they invest in seed stage companies all the way from idea to a little bit of traction. And currently, or before that, I was founder of a company called Kabam. We made games on the mobile phone. We raised over $245 million and exited to Netmarble and Fox for about $1 billion.
Billion with a B.
Yeah.
Really awesome.
Oh, and sorry, our employee headcount at our height was 1,500 with 6 offices. So if anybody has those kind of questions, but I have a feeling that's probably not, I would say don't hire people if you can't. You can't conserve cash at the stage that you're at.
Dawoon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Dawoon. I am the founder and co-founder and co-CEO of Coffee Meets Bagel. We are a dating app for singles looking for real connections. And we closed our Series B last year, and the total number of funding that we raised is about $22 million. And we are a company of about 50 people.
Awesome. And then Laura.
Hey, my name is Laura. I'm super inspired to see the participant count go up, and we're at like 208 participants right now. Yeah, I started a company called Shippo. We power shipping for e-commerce. And what that means is that we offer shipping software. Our customers are e-commerce stores. We have roughly, I think, 80 people here in our office. We're headquartered in San Francisco. In total, we've raised $29 million. Our last round of financing was Bessemer Venture Partners, and was a Series B by Bessemer Venture Partners, and now I'm like starting to get ready for another round of financing as well again. So like this is top of mind for me.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. You guys are super busy, so really appreciate you spending the evening with us. So I made a few questions that I want to ask first just on the topic to make sure that we cover them, and then I'm going to spend a lot of the time looking at the questions from the attendees. So the first question is, let's talk about, we talked about in the last session kind of running a process and trying to like get introductions to investors from other founders and different ways to reach out. But let's say that you actually get an introduction to an investor, or as an investor, you get an introduction. Like, what do you include in that email to, like, let's say a founder is like, yeah, I like send a note to First Round or something. Like, what do you include in that email that you send to the founder, and then also like in your first email to the investor? And any of you can sort of chime in. We might end up talking over each other a tiny bit at the beginning, but we'll figure it out.
I can start or try starting. So I think it happens a lot that you meet people and in the end, like you offer introductions, and I think, or other people offer introductions to you. It has happened to us at the beginning as well. And I think you for sure want to like follow up with these people. People say they're going to introduce you and they might forget because they're like busy doing other things. So I think my first point here is like, don't hesitate to follow up and like to ask a few times just in case they've forgotten or if they've forgotten. And then you want to make it as easy as possible for the other founders or your friends to introduce you to the right people, meaning that you want to write a little bit of a blurb. You as the founder, you know your company best, and you want to like quickly say what your company does. So I would say like, I'm like Laura from Shippo. Shippo powers shipping for e-commerce. And then you want to introduce your company with a very like a few numbers that are relevant to your business. So early on, I would say we started our company 3 months ago. We're shipping X amount of packages every month, and we're growing at 40% week over week, or some impressive growth stat. And then end up with an ask like, we're currently trying to raise a round of financing, would love to meet. And I would keep it like short and sweet, just like my name, what the company does, one impressive growth number, and that I would love a meeting to raise a round of financing, and that's it.
Awesome. And did you include the deck in that email, or do you try to not include it?
Yeah, I would love to hear other takes as well, but I think for me in that first email with the blurb asking for an introduction, I typically don't include the deck. And then when I am in the meeting, the first meeting might be a coffee meeting. So if I can talk with the person face to face without having to stick to a deck, I feel like that conversation always goes a little better, at least in the first meeting. I will have the deck ready in case they're expecting it. So it depends on the setting. I'll for sure have it ready to show if everyone's sitting in a room like pointing at the screen. If not, if it's over coffee, just like I think a real human connection is easier established without a deck.
Yeah, generally I would agree with that. Like if it's I'm trying to connect with an investor, if you send a deck, and I'm probably throwing a lot of investors under the bus, it gives them a chance to pass on you. So anybody that does like B2B sales knows that like the more you could do something in person, the easier it is for you to convince them. Why? Because you could read the body language, you could see how it goes, you could double click in deeper, you could get to know the person, they could get to know you. It just is so much better. So it's much better just to try to get a meeting on the books as much as possible, and try to convert them in person. Now the next step is a video call. Sometimes that happens remotely, but usually if you haven't had that conversation with them already, if this is the first time, it's best to just, I think much better, especially at seed stage, to say, hey, can we just walk through, would love to walk with you through the deck, but like, here's some of the information. And what Laura did would be something exactly what I would do, a short one-liner and like 3 or 4 most impressive bullet points about your company, and say, I would love to share more with you. Do you have time to meet? I think you should always try to push for a call. And Felicia, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Was it like intro to investors? Is it?
Yeah, like what to include in the email, like to the person that's introducing you, or in your first email with the investor.
And I apologize if this is in the kind of materials already, but I highly recommend don't ever kind of take an intro from another investor to another investor until they have invested. That's usually like, if they pass on you. Now it's a little different. Usually like if they're trying to introduce you to their buddy, they're probably trying to help ask you to do due diligence, ask their buddy to do diligence of like, hey, what do you think? But usually we don't, I don't know. I just think like, it's just the first signal that they ask that person, that investor gave to you, to be like, did you invest? And if they say no, then it's like a dead lead basically. So you should certainly do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like you should only take interest from those who've already invested in you. That's what I think. Of course, I think there might be some people who disagree. Sometimes people pass and say it's just not my thing, but I know somebody else in that sector. I think that's okay. Take that kind of intro.
That makes sense.
So I think putting my like investor hat on, my ideal checklist, and this is ideal, my ideal checklist for an intro is that it was a mutual opt-in. So it's an intro someone asked if I wanted before they provided it. When they asked, they provided at least a blurb and a link to the founder's LinkedIn. Because at the seed stage, sometimes there's like so little about the company. A lot of it is about the person. When I get introed to the company, I like for there to be a deck. And I totally understand, Laura and Holly, while you might want to hold that back, because the more info that you give an investor up front, the more reasons I might find to be like, I don't need to take a meeting. But when I'm sorting through, sometimes dozens of potential intros every day, more info is helpful. So I think that like the happy medium is perhaps a teaser deck where you're able to clearly describe the market that you're going after, what makes your approach unique and different, a little bit about the team, and also be super clear about how much you're raising to make sure that it's the right fit for me as a fund. And that helps me figure out, okay, I don't want to waste this founder's time. I never want to be in a situation where I accept an intro only to find out in the first 5 minutes of a call that like, it's not the right industry or they're raising an amount that just isn't a fit. So that's from the investor perspective, my ideal checklist for an intro.
That makes sense. I like the idea of the teaser deck too. I generally have tried not to include the deck for the reasons that others said, because the more information, but when people have insisted, I've like pared it way down so that there's very little that they could turn me down from the deck anyway. So it's kind of like what you're saying.
Like you take out any sort of like revenue projection,
Yeah.
you could take out some of the like traction stuff, except like your favorite metrics, like really put your best foot forward, but like don't pretend you're something you're not, or else you'll end up, when I raised my seed round, I talked to a lot of investors I shouldn't have, and your time is so valuable. So I think include enough information that like you vet the investor meetings that you're about to take.
And I think if you're going to do a teaser deck, then you should pretend it's almost as if you're speaking to it, so that they would have to need you to tell the story. The deck should never tell the story. The founder should be telling the story, in my mind. Like you should control your own story. So if the teaser deck is super helpful for some investors, and I bet you, and maybe Haley, you can corroborate, is I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want it very long. I would imagine just like 5 or 6 like slides, and probably include some of the most basic things like, what are you building? What's the market size? Your team? And if you want to, some high level traction of your growth or something, what percentage? That's what I would imagine, but you probably accept a lot of these teaser decks more so than we do, but that's what I would think.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that's been kind of said. I am very reluctant to share too much from the very beginning. And so I also don't attach anything, although I get where Haley's coming from. And then one thing that I also do add is sometimes like the investor, especially if they're not familiar with the market, like actually giving them the size of the market to get them excited. Oh, this is like, I don't know, $100 billion market size. And, we're disrupting it by this way. And, just to give them a sense that even if it's like you own like, 3-4% of the market, it's a huge opportunity. And then it's interesting, Haley, that you actually mentioned that we should say how much you're raising. I also don't like to talk about that kind of stuff because depending on how the raise goes, that number might change. And it just feels like revealing too much at once. And so I'm very careful when I was raising, careful with sharing those kind of numbers in writing upfront, like even before meeting with anyone.
I think
because they can always get passed around. That's
Yeah.
the only thing you need to know about these emails is things get passed around. So never ever include anything that's like trade secret. And I can absolutely understand, like,
I guess a way to clarify is to say what stage rounds you're raising, and a range is totally fine. But for first rounds, like if your target fundraise is like 250K, or you're like in a friends and family round and you're reaching out to me, that's very different than saying, you know, I've raised this amount previously and we're going out for institutional seed. That's like, okay, yes, you're in the right bucket for me. And then I often have people reaching out who are raising like $7 million, and our fund can't lead rounds like that. It's just not our business model. And so I prefer if there's, you know, a series A of 7 to 10, like that's not something that I think is, you have to worry about the paper trail on. And I'll just add one thing that, like, with the market, like, teach me something, tell me something unexpected, like raise my eyebrows in terms of being, oh wow, like I didn't know that about the market or how you're different than the competitors. Like the best way to like get me leaning forward to take a meeting is to have me like wanting to get some questions answered face to face.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm thinking about also as I'm about to, or thinking about our next fundraise is, I think my investors have given me the advice to anchor low. So even if you're hoping to raise, let's say 2 million, you might not end up raising 2 million. You might want to start by saying, I'm raising $1 million, $1.5 million. And if it goes up higher, that's awesome. But if you say you're raising 2 million and in the end you're only raising $1 million, that's a different kind of signaling. And then one other thing that I've seen with my investors is like a lot of actually like our newer competitors try to hit up our existing investors because they think that because they've invested in Shippo, they're interested in the shipping space. I would not, like, investors are not going to invest in a company that's competitive with one of their portfolio companies. What often happens is like the investors just immediately forward the deck, like all that data.
yeah.
And so I just wouldn't do that.
I'm gonna stick up for investors that do not do that. First, don't invest in competitive companies. And like, I really do feel that reputation is like the only thing an investor has, and that to do that is really putting that at risk. So I know bad behavior happens, but don't expect.
That's what I'm saying, that investors are not going to invest in your company if they already have a competitor in their portfolio. It's just if you send an email, if you send your deck to them, they might forward it to their existing portfolio company.
They shouldn't.
Yeah, but it happens, right? There's all these things that get emailed, especially like, even if it's not a firm, like angel investors, because they're usually like a little bit alone. So they're like, they just want feedback or something like that. It's just assume that it can get around. That's all as possible. So don't put in your trade secret. There was a couple questions in the chat about like a one pager or detailed email. I think that just know that we have a bunch of emails to read as an investor, that too much information might be no information at all. So you have to try to be as concise as possible and keep it as high level. I think a one pager, if it just can't fit in your email very easily, then I have a feeling the one pager is all going to be text. So I'm like, why don't you just put that in the email? So I just wanted to make sure I ended up hitting that up. Doc send, I've definitely seen a lot of doc send via Dex, and I think that that's okay. So you can see who is seeing the deck. That's fine. And then partial competitors, I think it depends on, like, you just have to kind of protect yourself in some ways, because, you know, they're more than happy to learn more information from you. Investors are, right? Like, they're learning more about the space and all of that. You got to think investors, they have no urgency to, I guess I'm throwing all of us under the bus, but like we need more information. We're information hungry. We want to know as much information as possible. So I make a decision.
Yeah. So definitely, I agree with Laura, like, and Holly. You don't want to, very unlikely that somebody's going to invest in you if they actually invested in your competitor. So probably not good to go there. What is good is maybe partial overlap, or like similar kind of industry where a lot of learnings from that could apply to your industry. So for example, like, I'm a dating app, and we actually approached a lot of people who invested in social gaming or social network that is not really dating, but like the way you think about that, the company is similar. And the thing about investors is like, it's very hard to invest if they don't know anything about your space, right? They need to actually know the space and know how to evaluate it to actually even know if they actually feel excited about you. And so I do think that looking at the investors' previous investments and seeing if they actually do have some knowledge in your space or know how to evaluate, that is important. Because if you go to somebody who doesn't know anything about that space, very likely it's hard for them to actually get up to speed in the timing that you want to be able to invest. And also, like what Haley said, the stages of the company, their investment matters too. Like you don't want to go to like Series A, B investors when you're raising for seed. And so I think that research is very important.
I also kind of want to make a couple caveats on like investors, because we're throwing them around like pretty generally. And then you're right, David, there is a difference between Series A, Series B. Like Series A investors like Sequoia, they only make maybe 1-2 bets a year, right? And the reason why they come up to you and look for seed and like come in and put in a little bit early is they want to know about you. Like Series A is their business. I will even say like YC, we're a small pre-seed. We're pretty clear. We invest in competitors. Like we have a batch of 200 companies. It's super large. It's $150K for 7%, right? So it's going to be really hard. I would even say angel investors. These are like private, like individual, wealthy individuals. They probably will be a lot looser on funding competitors. And I'd almost say the larger their portfolio, the harder it is for them to, they're just doing the pray and spray method, right? Like you can even say like we are at YC in some ways. Like, I mean, it's just bigger, right? And to be able to like kind of figure out, because you just don't know about those early bets and it costs less. So with those, I wouldn't be as crazy about, because it's just so many in their portfolio. And then as you get to the larger like seed funds, they have less people and less focus on it. So like, I'm sure Haley sits there and thinks a lot about like the kind of bets she's going to make. And I don't know if you have unlimited bets, but I'm pretty sure you think pretty strategically about which bets you're going to take and which ones can kind of fit into it. So you just have to be kind of, there's angel investors, and those usually do loose and fast, and they're probably not, I mean, they could be strategic and that like, hey, this person worked at Twitch and I'm working on an esports thing, all the way to just like, hey, I run a fund in Abu Dhabi and I just need access to some really cool technology. And I almost want to say the smaller the check size, the less kind of like professional they'll be in some ways, in terms of like, hey, let's really look at it. There's also another new kind of investor called a scout. So sometimes like they'll, like some folks who are operating, they can invest in you guys as well. You just have to ask like, where's the money coming from? And just know if it's like some other fund backing them, probably the exchange is some type of information about your company. I don't think you really have to worry when you're this small, in all honesty, if it's from Scout or from a fund that's bigger backing it. More than likely you need some, but also going back to Laura's point about just getting momentum into your, it's always much better to like bump up how much you're raising at what cap than to walk it back down. So the worst thing is, the best thing is try to get momentum. So she was saying like raise a little bit less. So you can say 1 million on 10, get a little bit of that going in, and then you can push some urgency and be like, oh, you know what? We've already filled up most of our round. That kind of creates some type of deadline for investors. And when I say investors, I'm usually talking about seed, because most of you guys are probably at the seed stage, because then you'll be like, hey, it's going to miss out. Yeah. So then the caps will rise. Like you could push the urgent, but no fake stuff. Like you can't create any. Everybody asks us like, how do you create FOMO? How do you create FOMO? There's really, you shouldn't be creating FOMO, but what you can do is convey a sense of urgency. You can do that through body language. You can do that through like, I'd love to meet, but I have, the round is moving pretty quickly. I have some meetings stacked up. Would love to hear back from you in a couple of days. Do you think that could happen or not? Just make sure every meeting you have can lead to another meeting, which is probably something that's in the materials as well, that it's like a fundraising period. You have to really think about like a focus around it. Don't just try it out and then come back. It's going to be
we talked about process in the last one a lot about.
Oh, perfect. Sorry. Okay.
That's okay. Okay. So I want to call out a few things. So first of all, a few really awesome comments. Like someone said their friend is getting married that met on Coffee Meets Bagel, and they're like dating someone from Coffee Meets Bagel. And then someone said, I can't live without Shippo. So we're getting some love for people on the panel, which is awesome. And then I also want to mention, someone said, is it okay to connect with speakers on LinkedIn for networking? You can message people. I think it's not part of the commitment that they'll connect with everyone, because there's a lot of people, and I think that all of the panelists are mentors, and so they have committed to doing like 45 minutes with one mentee every 2 months. So I think that's kind of the commitment that they'll do. But they might connect, but I don't want to promise that they will connect with everybody, just because that would take a lot of their time, and they're really busy too. So I just want to answer that question. Someone else asked, I was told that you can say that you're looking for advice, not money. What do I think people have different opinions on that approach. What does the panel think about that approach?
I don't know why I was, oh yes, a few days ago, I was at a female founder dinner, and like my thinking is like, we should just say what we want. If we're looking for money, we should say that we're looking for money. If we're looking for advice, we should say that we're looking for advice. But that's my personal opinion. I've pitched people where I took the advice, like, ask for advice, not money. And I asked for advice, like, they gave me advice, but what I actually wanted was money. Then it's on me. I didn't ask for money. I was like hoping that they will figure it out, but they didn't.
Yeah, I think with investors, it's their job to find like phenomenal founders like yourselves. So reality is like, even if you just come to them for advice, like, you should ask for what you want, I think. Otherwise it gets like super confusing. And even if you go to angel investors, so I'm a little bit with Laura. I think like, if you want advice, get advice. If you want like money, then ask for money, kind of thing. And don't forget to ask. So oftentimes someone's pitching me as an angel and they just like kind of forget to ask. And I'm like, what a waste of time. I guess they really don't want me, so I'll just move on. And that's like, there's probably a whole specific like chapter on dealing with angels. Trust me. So angels are funny animals, I think.
I would agree. I think you'd be surprised how many intros I get where it's unclear, where it's like, they'd really like to meet you. I'm like, cool. Why? Are you looking for advice, or are you actively fundraising? And I can't take every meeting that's about advice. I can't take it with as urgent a timeline. It helps me sort of prioritize in terms of the founders that are actively fundraising probably are going to go sooner in the queue and are going to get scheduled within 2 weeks. Advice is probably going to be a phone call. It might not be put on the calendar as quickly, but just be clear. And I think if you're trying to like hook money through advice, it's going to mess up your timeline. It's just going to confuse an investor's process. That said, I'm not opposed to founders who want to build a relationship or get input before they're actively fundraising. I just really like when they're clear about that, to be like, we know what we're working on. We would love your advice, given your experience in this space. We're not going to be fundraising until X date, but do you have time for a call? Like, that's just really straightforward, and I know how to evaluate that and give a good, appropriate answer.
And if you really are asking advice, the more specific you can be, the better. The ones that are really hard to prioritize are the ones that, like, I just want to pick your brain. And I'm like, oh man, this could go like every which way. And it's better use of your time as well as the person on the other side to be like, okay, what kind of specific advice can I help with? So we all just want to be mindful of time, especially your time. You guys are building a company.
Yeah. Haley, I have a question though. This isn't what I did, so I'm curious. Like, I do hear a lot about like, oh, hey, you really should ask for advice, not money, and like, get them actually kind of excited as you share, and then have them come after you, right? And sounds like you're kind of not. Maybe you're saying that's kind of maybe not a good idea. Like, you need to be really clear. Like, what do you think about that?
I don't like it as like a tricky tactic. I think sometimes it happens. I think someone who authentically is in a mode of seeking advice can meet an investor where the investor gets excited about what they're building. Through the conversation, the investor figures out, oh, wow, like there might be enough here that they should raise sooner than they thought. And then it accelerates into a fundraise process. That happens all the time. But I also think probably most fundraise process is an organized one when the founder is ready. They're upfront about what they're looking for. They're organized. They're meeting all the investors on the same time frame. I personally don't like the hook, but who knows? Maybe people have used it on me, and I don't.
I mean, I think again, I didn't do that, so I do think. Kind of like what Laura said, it is important to be authentic. Like if you really are actually raising money and then you're asking for advice, probably it's just not, that probably is not true. You don't really want to do that. But at the same time, I also think, the saying of like, oh, best time to raise is when you don't need the money, right? That is really true. Like when I think back to my seed, and I actually was in a situation where when I was meeting people, it was like, I didn't really need the money. And the conversation is much easier when you're not trying to pitch and sell. And so to the extent that you can actually get into the situation, I think it's best. And in that case, you're actually truly asking for.
Totally. I think there's like a part, and maybe this was covered in the process conversation last week, but there can be part of a fundraise, which is the like meet and greet, get to know people, which is in advance of the I'm asking for money and formally pitching. And I think for some founders, having that like meet and greet and get to know people is a really important and helpful part of the process.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're describing, that you're always fundraising as a CEO, right? Like anytime you meet with a customer or anytime you meet with an investor, you're representing your company, so you're kind of fundraising, but it doesn't mean that you're asking for money that day.
That all makes sense. I have this general perception that when people are asking for advice to investors, but they're kind of fundraising, like it kind of comes across less confident, because it's sort of like, why aren't you just being straightforward, like kind of like Laura was saying. So, and that being said, I have had one convert from when I was asking, because I legitimately was asking for advice in between rounds, like because he knew a lot about a certain area, and then he like wanted to invest, ended up investing later. So it makes sense. Okay, so I want to talk more about pitch decks, and I mentioned this in the email leading up to this session, but Aileen Lee did an amazing job walking us through in the June Bootcamp, like to-dos and not to-dos of pitch decks, and she made this great deck about pitch decks that I shared a couple of days ago with everybody. So I as I mentioned, like I definitely recommend watching that, and we're not going to kind of redo that this time. But I do want to cover some tips from the group on pitch decks, in particular, just like, how long do you think one should be, and just like kind of best practices and worst practices. Like if you were, as an investor, you've probably seen so many, and what are things that like make one stand out, and what are things that, make you really not like excited about the company, and then maybe as a founder, like things that you've learned that you think are best practices and things to avoid with pitch decks.
So sometimes, and this is general with pitches, is they tell me what the company does, but I still don't know what they do. So they're not very clear on explaining what their company is. So oftentimes they'll be like, hi, I'm an AI fintech real estate company. And I'm like, what do they do? They're like, we take, so it'd be much better if it was like, hi, we use AI to find the cheapest real estate prices. Like, what does it do? Versus like what it is. Like, oh, we're a fashion retail AI company. I'm like, I just don't know what it does. So I think that's like the first kind of like one-liner, and that's almost like you kind of have to use that to hook an investor. And we always say it's much easier to hook an investor by just being clear in many ways, and it doesn't have to be so, I know what people think is like what's so glamorous is really, you know, we're creating the future and disrupting work, but I'm like, I still don't know what you do. So I need some type of clear picture in my head to like just hang my hat on it. And then once I know what you do, then there's so many questions I can ask about that. But if I don't know what you do, then the rest of the conversation becomes like, I'm just getting pitched at. And then sometimes that gets like super, super frustrating. The other thing that I personally prefer and really like is what people end up doing is they do a top down of the market. I usually like seeing a bottoms up. This is like seed stage because I like seeing a total addressable market. Usually, to me, it paints a bigger story. It's so funny because I feel like the most interesting stories start out really small, like really boring sounding. And then you're like, but what you don't know, kind of like what Haley was telling, like, teach me something new. Like somebody was doing something on brick and mortar for small and medium-sized businesses. And they're like, but what you don't know, Holly, 85% of retail purchases are still from brick and mortar. I'm like, oh, tell me more about that, right? Like, and so that's kind of what is kind of very interesting. But if you don't start out with what you do, then that's a problem. Going back to a bottoms up, that's kind of like the same model of like, hey, this is like, say like you're selling to restaurants. Thing we do, like the number of restaurants, you multiply what you charge those restaurants yearly, and that's your total addressable market. Those are dollars that are addressable to you. And then I'm like, oh, okay, if it's like, I personally like a couple of billions behind, like a couple zeros behind it, because I always know it's really hard to get like a percentage of that or to get 90. So the smaller the market, the harder it is for a founder to be like, well, it's not a founder for a venture to put dollars in. Like if the total addressable market of like washing machines or people who own dogs that are half like water dog and half like golden retriever or something like super specific, it gets a little bit hard. And that's what, like, sometimes you'll hear like this isn't venture backable because we know it's harder to get like 90% of that market than it is to get like 1% of a huge market. So that's like, usually that's probably one of the number one things that I'm sure a lot of investors say to founders is like, make sure your market is huge, because we all know we've seen phenomenal founders and the market's just kind of rough there. Like it's just no matter what they do, it just like the timing isn't ready. It's either too early or too late. People just kind of aren't in terms of execution. And then probably one of the final things that kind of bothers me, and I don't know if it bothers Haley as much, is showing cumulative graphs. Like, of course, everything looks really good on cumulative. I want to see the growth underneath it. And usually the growth KPI for me is usually around revenue. And very rarely will it be around like social kind of usage in terms of DAUs or MAUs. It's usually like if you're building like a Facebook, and then we have a huge like elephant in the room about, okay, what's your business model after that? How are you going to make money? So those are kind of like the three things that I tend to see a lot of issues with and problematic. I don't know if other ones want to jump in because I could keep going.
I can share. I totally agree with Holly on. I was trying. It's been a while since I pitched, so I'm trying to recall my. I was trying to recall my pitch deck, but two things that came to me is that insight, I think, is so key. The insight that really surprised the investors who's actually listening. Like even when I recall my pitch, like the time when I actually really grabbed their attention is when I actually talk about, hey, did you know that in dating app industry, the gender dynamic is so lopsided? It's actually like 60%, 65% guys, like 35% women. And that's actually the reason why the experience is so bad for both. And then if you actually take into consideration the activity level of, guys and girls, it's actually even more, that kind of, they're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. That's kind of when I see people perk up. And I think just making sure that they know that you actually have an insight on the industry that nobody really has. And that's what actually is allowing you to disrupt this space like no one has done before. I think that kind of insight is what kind of gives them that conviction. So that's really important. And then the other thing is, I didn't really do this well when I was doing seed raise, and I wish I kind of did it differently, because I know it's very important and part of storytelling, especially if you're doing, I think, B2C, is the testament from the customers. And even if your customer base is small, things like the NPS score, or how disappointed are you going to be if if the product is discontinued? Like being able to actually share that kind of early user enthusiasm, I think actually is very important, especially when you're small and don't have a ton of numbers, because that, the investor is thinking, wow, like if you're early and you have so many customer advocate, and imagine if we get bigger and then you have more dollars to go out and acquire more customers, it's just going to be like a snowball effect. So I think having that, even if the customer base is small, like having some numbers that can actually tell the story of how enthusiastic and crazy they are about your product, I think is really important.
Completely agree. I think a few things that have already been said, but that worked very well for me is I started off the pitch deck by explaining how big the market is. So for us, it's e-commerce is the fastest growing $1 trillion industry out there, and every single e-commerce store needs to ship. So it's a very big market, and then breaking that down into, so there's a problem, everyone needs to ship. What's the problem here? Then we explain that shipping is outdated, or shipping technology is outdated, it's complicated, and Amazon Prime and all of these other factors. And then you explain that kind of shows the investor now is a good time to change something. Something external has changed, so it's a good time to build something new. And for us, that's been Amazon Prime is just really big, and more people are able to start online stores. So today's expectations are different from before. And then we tell something about early proof, which is initial traction. Initial traction is very, at the beginning, it's very small. It's very easy to show large growth numbers week over week or month over month. It gets harder as you scale. But yeah, early on, I would just pick one metric, not too many metrics. It gets complicated otherwise. And at the beginning, we only picked shipping volume as our number one metric that showed engagement. And then going into other details later on. But by then, people should get excited. There's a big market. The big market has a problem. You have early traction. Your customers like using your solution. Then you can explain how you make money. You can explain how you're different from other people, and so on.
Laura, I think that was an awesome outline. I think to oversimplify how we evaluate companies, there's a few categories. We're thinking about the market, the size of it, the quality. Then we think about the product. And then we think about the team. And so when you think about your pitch deck, make sure you're covering all three of those areas. I love a tops-down market size. I think you need to sort of just have a very large, expansive vision. Investors need to see basically 10 billion plus to believe that your company can be $1 billion company one day. At least institutional investors need to see that. I really like the narrative of a problem and a solution. I think that's the most compelling, and it's a way to tell a story. You could even do it from the viewpoint of a customer. So give examples or case studies of the problem, why it exists, and how you can solve it for it. You touched on why now, Laura, and that's a question that investors are always thinking about. It's okay, well, this market's existed forever. Other people have tried to solve this problem. Why now? What's different about 2019 or 2020 that a big company is going to be built to solve this? And so if you're able to supply the answer to why now, that gets investors really jazzed. And then why you? So why are you as a founder, or your founding team, the people in the whole universe that are going to be able to crack this and that are going to stick to it, right? And there needs to be some reason, whether it's a personal story or a professional experience or some insight that you have that makes the team a really good fit. In terms of traction, not every seed stage company will have traction. First round, probably half the time is investing in companies before they have revenue or before they have customers. But but the thing that you could fill in instead of traction is just sort of proof points or insights. And so that could come in the form of like customer surveys or user testing, just like other ways that you've really gotten your idea or your solution in front of customers, and that you could bring some data to why there's a quality and compelling solution that's different than what else is out there.
So one last point, I think, not to forget, like the pitch deck, you're going to talk to it. So it shouldn't be too long. It should be, you might, if you get a meeting, it might take an hour, 45 minutes to an hour is a meeting. So you want to talk for, I think, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then allow for another 20, 30 minutes of discussion. So like the deck should be 20, 25 minutes, but not longer than that.
And then I also want to go back to a point where I realized I may not have been clear about like where I don't prefer top down and Haley does. When I say top down, I don't really prefer like, oh, our market is X, say like I'm going after women clothing, and like women spend this much in clothing. That's what Gartner report says. I'm very interested in like, this is what we priced at. This is on average how many women spend on dresses. Like so one piece of that equation can be research, but I don't really like the top down, but I'm not too sure if that's what, but I do like to have a lot of zeros. I agree with Haley on that. Billions in that market. We all like big markets.
I guess the thing that I've seen founders fall into a trap of is a really bottoms up approach where it's like, if we get this many customers that are this size business and this many customers that are that size business, and like there's a spreadsheet behind it, and you think that you're doing a really diligent job of like building up a market size, it actually is just making me think about, oh, this is going to be hard to do, or maybe it's not large enough. And instead, if you're just staying at the high level, it's easier to be like, okay, big market, if they solve it, it'll be fine.
That totally makes sense. Like basically, I think what you're pointing to is this idea of like, if you have just way too many thin assumptions there, then it starts breaking down. And I think what you're also talking to is inevitability. Like usually after a pitch, I want to hear like, wow, it's inevitable that this problem exists, that it's entirely, I guess I'm using problem and market interchangeably in this. It exists. Your solution is something that people want, and you're the team to do it. And like every single link, inevitability, it'd be great to have inevitability in there. Wow, this is inevitable that this is going to happen. It's inevitable that people are going to use this, and it's inevitable that there is this team is the one to do it. Like no questions asked kind of thing. And then you're like, oh crap, I gotta go. That's just like that's some
feeling of inevitability is kind of your job during the pitch. I agree.
Awesome.
And sometimes that insight can be very overlooked. Sometimes it doesn't have to be an obvious insight either, or an obvious statement like remote work will be the future. Like, okay, that totally makes sense. Like sometimes like Airbnb was like not obvious, but it became inevitable. All right, sorry, Alicia, go ahead.
No, you're good. Thank you. Okay, one tactical question that's come up is like, what format? So let's say that you do end up sending a deck, maybe it's even after the meeting or something. You know, you can send a PDF, you can send it in Google Drive, you can send it in DocSend, like kind of a just tactical question of founders, what you prefer, investors, what you prefer for that.
I don't care.
I used DocSend just because I didn't want deck to be forwarded around.
Yeah, I like DocSend because I like to be able to see who viewed it. I like people have to enter their email, and I like to be able to see who viewed it, and also like how long they spent on different parts, like and stuff like that, because it's useful to be like, oh, they're really concerned about that. I'm going to make sure to talk about that or whatever. Laura, do you have a preference?
Always send out attachments. There was no specific reason. It just no specific. I don't have a good answer. I've just sent out attachments and haven't thought about it deeply.
Okay, cool. All right, and then so let's say you are in the meeting, and as Laura said, you kind of go through your pitch, and then you're in the discussion part. Like, they're asking you questions, or maybe they've stopped you partway through the deck. Can you guys talk about like what are some of the most common questions that investors will ask founders and tips for answering those questions well?
So if it's at the beginning and I don't understand what you do, I'll ask like more specific questions of, can you give me an example, a specific example, and that will help me paint the picture? Or who is your ideal customer? Like if it's like, I can't understand what problem they're solving, or sometimes I'll just straight up ask like, what problem are you solving? And then I always think examples are like super helpful if you get kind of caught up in that space in terms of you're using maybe too much jargon, because I do think an investor pitch is extremely different than a customer pitch. You will know your customer the best, but like investors need to know, like they care about market sizes, they care about like traction, they care about other things that I don't think customers care about as much. In some spaces, they will care about what they call social proof, like in B2B, like what other people are using you. But like investors also care about that as well. But like if you're B2C company, it doesn't matter as much kind of thing. So that is definitely one place where I just start stopping people if I can't understand what they do. Or sadly, what's worse is if an investor just kind of tunes out and walks away. So it depends on like what environment it's at. Like if it's at a party or something, you just have like 2 minutes for the elevator pitch. Sometimes if you're not clear enough, then it might be the kind of like they just won't dig in even more. And then sometimes they aren't the right person to be investing in you. That's for sure.
So a few things. So I think when like just generally speaking, for no specific question, but like if someone asks you a question and you can't answer it, better say you can't answer it and you'll get back to them, or I don't know, but I'll get back to you. I would not bullshit or make something up. And I've heard good feedback when I've like just said, hey, I don't know, but like I'll follow up by end of day. And that can be like a number that I don't remember by heart, or like something, but I just don't make things up, and it's completely fine not to know everything. And then the other thing I often get asked, like, and I hear that in some sort of variation from everyone, like, what if Amazon does this? Or what if insert giant company does this? And then have an answer for that. And the last thing, I think, even before you go into your pitch, I like to start off with just a personal introduction that's not included in any slide, but just like, hey, my name is Laura. I'm here to pitch Shippo. And then, like, as someone already said, with the founding story, why I'm excited to pitch this. And then I go into the slide deck, but just making sure that that I don't just jump into the deck, but I introduce myself and say hi.
I got asked, I remember when I first started fundraising, I was so busy talking about the product. I think I didn't spend as much time like sharing my thoughts on go-to-market. And so just like, you know, especially like for app developers, user acquisition, you know, paid acquisition can get really expensive. So how do you actually plan on like go-to-market? We actually had to spend quite a bit of time preparing for those go-to-market questions.
So I think there's a bunch of common ways that pitches start that you should be prepared to handle. Like one of them is like, it might not just be like, oh, start pitching, start on slide 1. It'll be like, so tell me about yourself and like why you started this company. And I think as a founder, you need to have a really good answer to that also actually like starts your pitch. The other way that, I guess that's the most common way that people start. After you've gone through things, I think there's a few like typical investor things that get asked. Like defensibility is such a buzzword. It's like, okay, cool. Like, let's say you do this and it goes well. What's going to stop other people from doing it, whether it's fast followers or incumbents? And you should have a really good answer to defensibility. Sometimes investors want to double click just on like market trends if it's not a market that they don't know well. So being able to like go deeper into market segments, the different players, things that you believe will change in the market over time, stuff that might not be in your pitch deck that makes it clear that you really understand the dynamics of your industry. And then also, like, once the pitch is done, a lot of times investors are going to be like, okay, so let's talk about the fundraise, and be prepared to make the ask, to be able to say, here's how much we're raising, here's where we are in the process. Then the other thing is like, what questions do you have? So like, just like any interview, if you're like trying to get a job, you should have some good questions that you ask the investor, whether it's about the process, or about their interest, or some way that you could get feedback from them to help improve and refine your pitch over time.
Awesome. Haley, we got a question from someone saying, what's a good way to answer defensibility? Can you sort of give like an example of one that you liked that someone answered?
Ooh, yeah, I mean, defensibility really depends on your business model. There's different categories of defensibility. Sometimes it comes from network effects. So like, all right, well, if we're able to be the first to launch and to grow big, like we will have the better product, because there's things inherent about scale that just, why would you go with a small version when you could go with the one where the product quality is informed by a data moat or a network effect advantage. Sometimes defensibility comes from operational complexity. So it's totally fine for you to just be like, this is really hard. We're the only ones who know how to do it. Sometimes it comes from brands. Like if you're a consumer company, be like, we know our customer inside or out. We know how to talk to her. We know how to build a close relationship with her. It's going to be hard for people to replicate that. Other forms of defensibility could be in the form of partnerships or customers, to be like, we're going to lock in through contracts or relationships the market, and it's going to be sticky and people are going to love it. And the stickiness can also come from product. It's like, oh, once people move over to us, they, it'll be too difficult, like for your business, Felicia. I'm sure once you get in and you're implemented, it would be a big deal for them to switch, and that's a form of defensibility as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, that's super helpful. And then someone asked if Dawoon, if you don't mind, and if you remember how you answered defensibility, if that came up when you were pitching.
It did, and honestly, I don't think I actually had a good answer to that, because the way I answered it was like, oh, we're actually building a brand, that brand equity, and if we have a reputation for focusing on quality over quantity, and our curation is really good, and then that brand actually attracts people who are really interested in real connections, and so then now you have a community of that people. But when you're small already, when you're small, like that defensibility is very, it's kind of weak, right? Because it's not like your brand equity is like everywhere. And so I think just being able to kind of have the conviction, convey the conviction, so that they can also bet on you, that you can actually go out and build that. I think that's the more important part, because in the very beginning, you don't really have a defensibility unless you're actually really high tech, company that actually have invested so many years building a technology that, patented and whatever. And then you that can't be replicated. And so in the beginning, I think just conveying that you can actually go out there and build that is more important than actually having a defensibility, because you really don't.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so one thing that I did when I was fundraising was I made a Google Doc of just questions that I was getting and how I answered it, and then I would sort of see how people reacted, and like if they reacted better, I would use that, and if they didn't react well, I'd try something different the next time. And then I sort of just kind of had my running list of these are the questions that come up, and here's how I like to answer them. So that was helpful for me, at least. It was almost like a study guide that I had. Cool.
I've actually seen a few people do like a hyperlinked FAQ when they get deeper into a diligence process. So like they know the 10 questions they've been getting, so they actually put together a deck that's like, here's the questions that you might be thinking, and then you could click on defensibility and it goes to like a written answer. That's not something that I would ever said in advance or before our first meeting, but as you get deeper, I've actually found that to be pretty impressive when the founder could sort of do what you did, but show it to investors.
That makes sense. That's cool. Okay, awesome. And then so we've kind of talked throughout the bootcamp about confidence and how, you know, investors' confidence in your business will be largely inferred based on your confidence in your business. And so, you know, coming across as confident in your business is really important. So this is actually the first time where we're really digging in. So would love to hear the panel's thoughts on how to project confidence when you're pitching.
I guess I can go first. So it depends on where you're pitching and kind of how you're pitching, but I think like how you do a lot of things can be incredibly helpful. We spent some time talking about this where, you know, you can say a lot through your body language. And I will say, particularly as women, we are taught with our body language to do this thing called playing low or playing smaller. There's a really good video from this Stanford professor called Deb Grunfield, who spends a lot of time talking about body language, and she introduces this concept called playing high and playing low. And in order to become a leader of any type, you really need to know how to do both. And playing high is really very much this idea of like, you know, you kind of close yourself off to the rest of the world because you're gaining authority, right? When you're very directive about things, if you think about like a king or a queen, like people follow them. You tend to be more relaxed, but you're always very clear in what you say. There's a beginning thought and an ending thought. And I think you can use that a lot in your meetings and practicing a lot of like that along with some body language. I'm a big fan of practice pitching as well. So with women, oftentimes like their body language will say that they're not confident, but they're saying that they're confident. So if you're like looking down and you're looking around, it's like, yeah, I'm going to crush it. I'm going to really worry that you're going to crush it or not, because your body language isn't going to be like open and be like, I'm going to crush it, right? So I think you could practice a lot of playing high. And then at the same time, I think founders, particularly female founders, need to also navigate what we call playing low, which is being more open, which is important as a leader because it's important to be likable and approachable and kind of have this warmth. And you're also asking for money because it's sometimes like you have to play a bit lower. And how do you kind of end up throwing out that ask? So I think a lot of things is you should definitely kind of practice first, and you can practice with your other founder friends on just like feedback on body language, right? Are you slouching? Are you not taking as much space as you can? Do you sound very nervous when you speak? Like there's a ton of nervous tics that can come through on kind of how you speak. I also think like the more you practice, the more confident you will be in your pitch and kind of what you're building and what you're doing. I think oftentimes, you know, I know as an operator, I always felt like everything was falling apart. And so it's really hard to take a step back and know like what's so amazing about your company. And you can probably even apply it to yourself. If I said, quick, tell me the 3 most impressive things about yourself, you'd just be like, I don't know. But like for Felicia, she's like highly strategic. She's really focused and she's like very empathetic. You know, like I would be able to say the top 3 things of each of these women on the panel, right? It's because I don't live inside their world. And I think we just kind of, as founders, you're so good at problem solving, it's just hard to step out. So I do feel like the more you practice with somebody else, and they can give you a lot of that feedback on like body language and things like that. I also agree. Some people don't believe on the body posing stuff, but I'm like, hey, whatever it takes, man, to get your minds like almost screwed on straight. Because the most important thing is like managing your own flippant psyche on this stuff, because you're going to be told no a bunch of times, and like the ability to recover will be kind of like equal to how successful you will be in the fundraise. So I absolutely think you should practice. There's some really small tips I would give, and this is what I give like kind of more particular to women, is if you are doing a coffee shop kind of meeting, you should certainly make sure that you have the most advantageous seat, meaning don't be in the way where, be at the place where you can see the exit sign or the door, right? Otherwise that other investor will be distracted. You control the time. You make sure that the next meetings are on the books. Make sure that you're in the dominant seat in many ways. So you can control the time and you can control the meeting very much. I also think if you do end up in like a meeting situation, into a room, if a chair can be raised, if you're short like me, you should raise that chair. Otherwise you'll be looking like, oh, it's a big opportunity versus this is a really big opportunity. I know you guys probably can't see much of it. So I think like for women in particular, those are a couple things that I give. And I absolutely think as you're thinking about going into your fundraise, to dedicate time around self-care. And I think self-care looks different for each and every person. And traditionally self-care is given to men around like exercise. And I think women should exercise and all that. But there's also, I want to be able to give permission to women to think about, you know what, maybe it is for a week, you know, and we also compress because YC has demo day. Like sometimes I'm like, maybe you should just go to the hotel. Like just book a hotel and stay there. And then you don't have to worry about cleaning. You don't have to worry about any of that crap. And then just like say, hey, I'm out kind of thing. Like I'm a big fan of that, but I don't know with the other, especially all the founders and operators, if how you guys have kind of handled it, because it's something that really takes over your life for a couple months. And maybe you guys have some really good tips and tricks, but I'm a big fan of getting all that out of the way so that you could just focus on your own psyche and confidence. And that's not selfish at all in many ways.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Holly. Like, I mean, the best way to project confidence is when you actually feel confident, right? Then you don't have to be faking it or like just, you know, not, if you're just feeling confident, whatever you do, even if you're not wearing the most powerful suit or whatever, it's just going to come across because it's just the energy that you're generating. And so I do think it's the most important thing is taking care of your mental psyche so that you do actually feel confident, because then everything just feels natural. And so like one of the things that I do now, even when I'm not fundraising, because, you know, this thing is very stressful and a lot of times I don't feel confident. And, you know, sometimes I see numbers and I'm like, whoa, is actually having a very set routine that I stick to, no matter what, because I know that if I actually like don't stick to that and work, even if it's to work longer because I have more to do, and I think that's more beneficial for my company. Now I actually don't do that anymore. I just stick to my routine because I know that if I don't, it's very damaging to my psyche, and that's like the most critical thing. And so, for example, like there are certain things that I actually do in every day in the morning. It's a routine called Morning Miracle. I meditate, I exercise, I actually do visualization. And that's actually very, very important for fundraising, like visualizing what's going to actually happen and how I'm going to come across and what I'm going to say. And just imagining that I'm walking that through in your head and what kind of energy you're going to generate. That's actually really powerful. So there are just certain things that I do in the morning, and also there's certain things that I do in the evening before I sleep. And really, unless there's some big emergency going on, I just stick to that, because again, like I know that if I don't, it's just gonna impact the way I show up, whether to investors or in front of my team. And then the other thing is, particularly for pitching, when I was pitching to investor, I think the important thing is like what Laura said, when there are things that you don't know, or if there are actually things about your industry or your company that is actually like there is a risk. I mean, every company has risk, every industry has risk and challenges, and not really shying away from that and engaging in the conversation when people ask about those, I think it's really important. Like, so for example, I remember I go to market was something that I got asked a lot. And then in the beginning, I was like, oh my God, like I need to actually like hide the fact that this can be a challenge. Like I just felt the need to fake it. But, you know, later on, it's like, yeah, actually, I agree that that could be a challenge. And, you know, this is how I think about user acquisition, yeah, we're not going to have the money. Like, we can't compete with Match when it comes to user acquisition cost. And so we already thought about that, and now we're, that's why our product has to be really differentiated enough. And that's why we actually measure NPS score in the first 7 days of our user, because we actually have to really rely on our organic customers and word of mouth for our growth. Like, actually having that kind of conversations, I think, boosts the investor's confidence in you, because you're not really actually shying away from the challenges that are really obviously out there. And so I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that advice to, like, no, if you don't know something, just say it. If something is a risk, just admit that you're not delusional. There is a risk. There are always risks, and have like a few good answers to that. I think what's been important for me is being like showing up, whatever is most authentic to you. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but whatever, like, just try, be yourself. If you're silly, you're silly. If you're like a very serious person, you're very serious. It's fine. Like, wear whatever you feel most comfortable in. You don't have to like wear something else just because you're fundraising. I have my like outfit kind of picked out, and it's always the same thing. It's always really simple. It's not because I overthink what I want to wear. It's more like because I don't want to think about what I'm going to wear. And then let's see. I think when I live in San Francisco, the pitches, a lot of them in person, happen in Menlo Park. When I drive down, I listen to my like playlist that makes me feel pumped up. I think everyone has music that they love listening to. It either calms you down or it like gets you pumped up, like exercise music, whatever that is. So I listen to my music. Always releases a lot of endorphins. And yeah, that's it. I think I like running on adrenaline. It's kind of like the 1 month where you're running on adrenaline and it's fine. And what Holly said, I think it's super important. Like, the more you practice, like I think at the beginning, maybe the first 3-4 pitches, and I kind of tried to do them with friends, like they weren't smooth and I got hung up on words. But then later on, you're in a flow state. Like, you're saying the same thing over and over again. Every pitch is supposed to be the same. So you're just going to be in that flow state of saying the same things over and over again. Like, I even got to the point where I was making the same jokes over and over again and pretending I'm making them the first time. And like, everyone's always laughing, I'm laughing, and that's it got so ridiculous.
So it's been a while since I've been on the other side of the table, and I guess it's easier said than done, but I think just try to enjoy it. It's like, kind of, fundraising is a necessary evil. I don't think anyone loves fundraising, but try to enjoy it. I think try to make it conversational. Like, it really doesn't have to be a monologue. Try to figure out like where in telling the story you want to ask the investor what they think or engage them in a back and forth. Like, put things in your deck that make you happy, whether that's like cheesy jokes that you always say on slide 7, or like a story about one of your customers, or a photo of an event that you held. Like, give Easter eggs to yourself that you're going to hit on that just make you smile, or make you like, if you said something silly the slide before, it'll like help pick you back up. And then I think, remember that it's your choice who to take money from. That even though you're pitching and you're like, it could feel like a slog and you're getting lots of no's, as soon as an investor says yes, it's actually your choice to be like, should I take that money? So it's really, it should be a two-way street. And I think remembering that could help make you feel more confident.
I like all of those. I've given a few of my tips and other ones, so I'm not going to go through. But yeah, I like what Haley just said. And to add to that, like, just keeping in mind that investors, like, it's their job to invest in great companies. And I'm sure that you believe that you are a great company, and therefore, like, you should believe that they will be like really lucky to invest in you. And so, you should just, like, if you kind of have that mindset going in, like, this is their job is to try to invest in me. And like, I feel like that can be a little bit empowering, and just kind of have that attitude in all of your interactions over email and in person. Because like Dawoon said, like, your energy will come through. And if over email you're like so surprised and grateful that they're going to meet with you, like that's going to come across as not confident. They're going to read into it as like, oh, maybe she's sort of desperate. And like, you want to give this air that like, you're going to fundraise. People are going to be interested in you, and it's just a matter of like who you're going to partner with. Then that will come across much stronger and become like inevitable. So one person asked on the confidence topic, is it frowned upon to be overly confident, or can you be seen, like, is it possible to be seen as too aggressive?
I'm sure you could be seen as too aggressive and be seen as overly confident. So this is where I think women do get into this double bind, and that's why I'm a huge fan of like kind of practicing with other folks on kind of the body language and kind of like how am I coming off, especially if you get the feedback kind of often on certain things, like on a certain way, then you can kind of try to tone it into a certain way or tune it into a certain way. I think one way to kind of overcome a crap ton of stuff is making a lot of progress in a short amount of time, and kind of trying to tell that story sometimes I think that can help overcome a ton of those things. And progress, I call it progress, but it's like a replacement for traction. I know you guys are so early that you don't like traction is kind of hard, but it could be like, say like you're selling a software to another business. And since the last time I talked to you, you just had LOIs. And then 3 months later, I talked to you again. Not only do you have customer pilots, you have new LOIs, you have all these people using you. And even though maybe you've come across like overly something or like, and then I'm like, wow, this founder can execute. So then I start putting all these other things aside, all the small kind of like ticks and quirks and all of that. And I'm just like, oh, okay, well then let's talk about your business. Let's kind of dig through. So I certainly think that there are ways in which that you can certainly attune yourself, but ultimately it's the business that you're selling, right? So in terms of telling the story around your business and shining the light on the most impressive things and the impressive amount of progress without obviously embellishing or lying, I think that can help overcome a lot of these things. But absolutely, that's why I think if you can learn how to play high and low, it could come to your advantage, right? So if you're being overly confident, then learning how to play low and deferring is to your advantage, right? In those situations. And it's unfortunate sometimes because it's like, well, why can't they just like me for this and how I'm acting? It's like, look, it's a two-way street. We all adjust to each other. So I certainly think that you just have to kind of start reading kind of the audience and where they perk up and where they don't, and where they're kind of like, hey, this is they're backing off, and you're like, okay, this is where I need to start playing low.
So I think there were a few questions about like how to call out what competitors are doing wrong. And I personally, I don't like shit talking my competitors, but I talk about what I'm doing well. So I will say things like, we're the only company doing X, or how we're different from everyone else is X, Y, and Z, and things like that. But I would never like point at a competitor and say they suck or anything in that matter. But that's a personal preference.
Oh, I agree with you, Laura, because otherwise you're spending all your time talking about your competitor, and that's never a spot you want to be in. So I think that's a really good tip, like that she said, like she's shown how you can pivot it back to how great you are, not what you and your company, right? Because do you really want to spend 90%? And now the investor is going to be like, well, maybe I should go after that competitor.
Going back to overly can you appear overly confident? Yeah, I guess you could, but I don't know if this is a good advice or not, but I almost like want to suggest that like, don't even worry about that. Like, that's kind of like, just focus on what story you want to share. And, if they kind of perceive that as like certain way, that's kind of not your problem. And like, okay, so you're overconfident. So what, like either what, like unless you actually come across reckless, because that actually has a business implication, I don't think it really matters. And I think if we start worrying about too much about, oh, am I going to come across this way? Am I going to come across that way? It's just going to be a huge distraction.
It's funny. I'm trying to think about if I've seen a founder come across overly confident in the last year or so, and like I don't think it exists. It's like we're used to as investors having founders come in and be like, "We're going to change the world." Like we haven't built it yet, but it's going to be awesome, and we're going to be $1 billion business one day. Like that is what we hear every day, and in some ways, that's absurd.
I agree with that. I don't think people come across overly confident because they won't use that word. What we will use is like they're delusional or they're lying, and you never ever want to cross that line.
I think the thing that was mentioned already, like people who pretend they have the answer to every question, like that's not good. There is an element these days. Sometimes people come across as like they're pitching on Shark Tank instead of having a conversation, and you're like, okay, they just read a script. Like that wasn't good. But I think confidence, in at least the definition that I'm thinking about it, like turn it up and don't worry.
That makes sense. I agree with that. Okay, cool. So someone asked about what do you recommend to wear to the pitch? I can chime in on a quick thought, and then people can, I think like kind of along lines of what other people have been saying, like do what's comfortable for you, whether it's like the way you talk, what you dress, like what you wear. So I think just like wear what you feel confident in. I probably would not get too dressed up and wear like a suit, because that is not typical, and I think you'll look like you're trying too hard. And I think most investors, especially on the West Coast, are more dressed down. So you might look overdressed, but aside from that, I would say to like wear whatever you're comfortable in. I wore like jeans and like a sweater, just like what I would normally wear.
Yeah, same thing for me. Jeans and a black sweater, my Patagonia jacket, and that's it. But that's also what I would wear to the office.
Mm-hmm.
I think like, just wear what you're comfortable in, and just know the context. Like there are some studies about like being overly overly attractive, and you're like, should you be going out for a nightclub tonight? Like that's just like, I don't know, just dress appropriately, but comfortably.
Cool. So someone brought up that when we were talking about pitch decks, we didn't talk about go-to-market, if your go-to-market plan. And do you guys want to talk about just like for the seed stage, like what level to go into that, if at all, in the pitch deck?
I think it's very important because we were asked a lot of that. Like, hey, it's okay, your product is great, but now it's about, there's so many apps and so many whatever. So how are you going to actually distribute? And so it is a very legitimate question, and that you actually have to answer. So I think it's very important that you put in a lot of time thinking about that, especially as like B2C.
I think I'll generalize this question to generally, if you have like a big elephant in the room about your business, it's good to have it like some type of answer in your back pocket, because you'll probably start getting a lot of questions about like, is your market too small? Like just repetitive questions. And then it'll be good to work out some answer, some way to answer that in a way that might make sense. So you can list like all these objections and have like just answer when you're ready kind of thing in your back pocket. And I definitely think go-to-market strategy, distribution is just a large question for a B2C and even B2B if you're not cold calling, or if you have to go up against some type of like big gorilla out there, that's certainly like, how are you going to grow is underneath all of that, right? The go-to-market strategy. So that's going to be something that's important as well. But many other businesses have other elephants in the room that they just need to be ready.
Awesome.
I think when we're evaluating a company, go-to-market can sometimes be super important in that, like, that is the innovation and it's why the company's going to win. And then we talk about it a lot. In other cases, it's less important. So I know that's annoying, but it depends. I think, you know, in general, in addition to being able to talk about the big vision, you should talk about like generally how you're going to execute over the next 12 to 18 months. And it doesn't, if you haven't started your go-to-market, that's fine. You could say, here's how we plan to do it. You could even have sort of a framework where you're like, we're going to try 3 different strategies or 3 different channels. And here's why we've chosen these 3. And here are some assumptions that we have about why these go-to-market approaches might work. But that's part of what we're going to learn with the seed money that you're going to give us. Yeah, be ready to talk about it, but it's varying levels of importance based on your business.
Well, another kind of similar question of just something that asking if something should be included and how much to go into is financial projections. So how important are financial projections to include, and like if you do include, what do you include?
I think it depends on the stage. If we're just talking about seed stage, everything is kind of guesswork. So I think guessing, if you're guessing too far out, it's not going to be accurate anyway. So I would show like how it's been growing so far if you have initial customers, and then a few just go to market channels where you think you're going to acquire customers. But if you're seed stage or even pre-seed, I think it's too much guesswork, and investors know that they can't hold you accountable for that anyway. And at our stage, for the next round of financing, the C, we are going to project two years out for sure.
So Laura, did you not include any projections in your seed? You kind of just said like, this is our progress to date and this is the market size kind of thing?
So I'm not sure if there's a one size fits all, but we're a B2B business where we go after SMBs. So, and our deal size is variable depending on how much they ship. So at that point, we didn't have enough data yet. It wasn't like every deal is $15,000 or something like that. So it's just, I think, yeah, we just did not have enough data to know, but we had initial data of how much we've been growing. And then the goal was for sure to sustain or even accelerate that growth.
For me, we did include it. And actually when I think I was asked to like, hey, where is the financial projection when I didn't have it? And I do think investors know, and Haley and Holly, I guess you can tell us from your shoes that it's probably not going to be that, but they still want to see, and they still want to see projections until at least like until the next funding event, and like how you're going to actually use the money. Like if you're saying you're raising $600,000, like where is it going to actually get you? So at least until that point, they want to see it, and you know you can use the historical numbers and you know maybe like some. So for example, like we weren't monetizing at the time we first raised, but we actually just kind of used the market like average, like that we kind of saw. And then you know, we kind of saw that like, oh, every one customer at Coffee Meets Bagel, they have like 3 friends actually on the platform. So we can assume that they're going to bring it through. So if we use those kind of number as an assumptions to project to the projections that we showed, at least until the next funding event. And again, yeah, that was like, I don't even remember what we put, and definitely that's not what happened, but they still wanted to see it. I think that was important part of knowing that, and how much money can they think they can, the money that we raised for this round can get you to, was an important element of the story for us.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think for my seed, I did not include projections. I just talked about like our progress to date and the market size. And I think I said like something, I don't even know if it was in a slide, but I said like over the next 12 to 18 months, we want to like do this much or something like that. But it was just to show that we were being aggressive and shooting for something that could get us to a Series A. Because I think people do want to know that you're thinking big, and that what you're shooting for will allow you to raise a Series A, and you won't just like go out of business. So that's kind of, I tried to like answer that question without getting too specific. Because as Laura said, I felt like it would be guessing and false precision, like if I was trying to do a model at that point.
Totally.
Yeah.
Why don't you go first, Haley?
Yeah, I think the only thing we know for sure, like whenever there's projections in a pitch, is that they're going to be wrong. They're either going to be too big or too small. I do think going through at least the theoretical exercise of at high level thinking about how your revenue and how your revenue is going to grow and how your costs are going to grow associated with it over a maybe 2 to 3 year time frame is like probably just something you should do as a business owner and CEO. Like it's worth thinking through. Does it have to be in the deck in a lot of detail? No, because it's false precision. But yeah, the things that Dawoon said about like why are you raising this amount? What's the use of cash going to be? How big are you going to be at the point where you need to fundraise next? Those are the kind of things that flow from financial projections. So it's probably worth going through the exercise. I very rarely as a seed investor will like open up an Excel spreadsheet and like go through the rows of a financial projection. But it does give me confidence to know that a founder they've done it.
So I absolutely agree with Haley, and I think projections are just going to be really difficult, but you need to know your business well, and you need to know kind of what it takes within probably, I would say, before I was telling 12 to 18 months to get ready for a Series A. But like what needs to happen to hit those Series A milestones? 12 to 18 months might be a little aggressive, maybe 18 to 24 months, and that's how you should plan how much you need to raise, right? So what are some Series A milestones? Like definitely B2B is a little bit easier. It's usually like, I don't know, Haley, you could correct me in what you're seeing in the market, but only around $1 million in ARR, annual recurring revenue. If you can get your revenue to that would be great. You should always watch your churn. There was somebody who was asking about, they wanted to know about Ebitda and churn. I think churn is always, unit economics are always very good to learn early on before you dump a bunch of money in terms of marketing and things like that. Especially it seems like churn is the opposite of retention, and it's kind of hard to give advice not knowing if you're B2B or B2C. The growth rate, I think that's what investors care a lot more about, is like how much are you growing at what pace? Like if it's like a 20% month over month growth that's organic, oh my God, that's like kind of crazy, right? You start thinking about that kind of exponential type thing. I think that is something that's there. And then also there's this weird thing of investor momentum. And I know Felicia could probably talk a bit about that, of like, is there appetite for something as that? But the most important thing as a founder is to build a very large business. So you get your fundraise ready in terms of those projections are there to inform what your fundraise should be. And I absolutely agree with like Haley and everybody else. It's like, we all kind of know that these projections are baloney, not because you're lying or anything, but because we can't tell that, nobody can tell the future and things are going to happen and you're so early on. But what we're looking for is something where you know, like you'll know kind of how to spend the money and what you're thinking about next to grow the business, right? And I think you have to be kind of smart about growing the business. On the one hand, like your whole goal is not to die, and on the other hand is to grow. So it's always good to have, just from putting on my founder hat, I think it's always good to have a little bit of money in the bank still and continue to grow so that you can get your next fundraise going, because it's like 3 to 6 months. It is a little bit of a cyclical treadmill, and probably the other founders and operators can also chime in on that, but it certainly is this thing that keeps going. So that's to the extent where, from a founder perspective, where financial projections can go into. What investors sometimes care about, and this is like varies between sectors, right? Like if you are B2B, I will care about your churn, because if you're like, hey, we grew to $1 million in ARR, but my churn has been like 50%, I go, oh my gosh, that doesn't seem really great. Tell me what's going on there. Or if you're a B2C and your retention's really crappy, you only retain 1% of the users after a month, then I'm like, oh man, that means people don't love you, right? I think investors are all looking for looking for love in really weird ways, but we just look at it through numbers, right? We look at it through either retention or churn, or how much people what's the growth rate like, you know, in terms of making something that people want. So ultimately, I think the financial projections are only there so far as to give you kind of high level of like, how are you going to spend the money to grow the business to get to your Series A goal? There was also a question about bringing a financial analyst. I don't recommend that. I think like they should teach you on how to get stronger on the numbers. I think it'll kind of not make you as credible. That's me, but somebody else could agree.
I agree with that. I don't think you should bring a business analyst to pitch meetings. It should be you. You should really own your numbers and learn them. And I think that will be something that is not expected and surprising.
Yeah, I think also it's okay to say you don't know on certain numbers, but the basic numbers of like what's your user growth or what's your revenue growth, it's probably much more around revenue growth. You know, what's your churn like? Some of those basic ones you should get very familiar about.
Cool. So a few people have asked what are appropriate seed milestones. I think what people are asking are like, what are milestones at which point, you know, you're ready to raise your seed? Please chime in. Like, there's been a few people that have asked that if that's what you're getting at there.
Yeah, the $1 million in ARR is for Series A. I'm sorry. Yeah, so in terms of seed, I'll just throw this out there as like a marker. For YC, we go from pre-seed to seed, and usually what we push founders to grow at is a 10% week over growth if they can do that. But that's pretty tough. But why not aim high and get there? So that's usually what we try to push. And then by demo day, it's like we usually look for, like they're usually raising seed at demo day, and it's usually around $1 million or so, like 500 to $1 million plus. But that's usually what we see. I don't know if Haley has something different because you're like a full-time focused, like you look at it from seed and beyond. Well, mainly seed, right? So Haley's in her investing type of seed funds are the type that fund our companies. So thank you very much. But they come in usually around what's your typical check size, Haley?
So we do all types of seeds. So we do pre-seed.
Oh, pre-seed as well. Okay.
What we call mango seeds, which are like monster seed rounds.
Mm-hmm.
And
what kinds of growth metrics are you looking at, or what kinds of progress?
We're often investing before there's a product or revenue, right, where it's really at the concept stage, but there's some sort of proof point or unique insight and a clear plan for what will be done with the dollars raised such that you could get to the next inflection point. So it's almost like that's how I describe seed milestones, is like being able to articulate like what you want to go after and why, how you're going to do it, and like what open questions there still are. And like you're going to raise, whether it's $500K or $5 million, like that money is to help test those hypotheses and to get you to the next level. And in some cases that could be, okay, we've proven that this works, we've delighted a small number of customers, or it could be more of like the traditional revenue metrics that you're talking about, Holly, of like, we've gotten to $2 million of ARR or $1 million. But there's a pretty wide range.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to wrap that up and say, I do think that's what makes it just a little bit tough, is like you could get it to this, but like if you don't have that story around it, then it's not totally, like it has to go hand in hand in so many ways. So I just also wanted, like, you can't just send a spreadsheet, just be like, hey, invest now, you know. There's a lot of other things that kind of need to happen as well, which is mainly story and all the other things we talked about, the market, the founders, the why now and why you.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we raise as a data point, it is so wide range. So please don't think that this is the number that you should shoot for. We didn't actually have a lot of customers. We had like 5,000 people. And that, I mean, we're B2C, right? I'm not talking about B2B. So 5,000 is like really nothing. But then just having that story of like, hey, these are like customer testimonial, and these are like the more people they're inviting and talking about CMB, like that story I think was more powerful than actual 5,000 number, which is very small.
Yeah, I think it's like the quality of the customer should come before the amount of customers. And sometimes people forget that and they're too focused on growth without being like, have we built the foundation to make sure that like we're just making our customers ridiculously happy, whether they're businesses or whether they're consumers. And sometimes that's all you need in order to raise the next round.
Yeah, I also think that like it's possible to raise when you're pre-revenue. It's possible to raise post-revenue, but if it's post-revenue, your numbers should be good. And you should be growing, or you should have like some customers that love you, like people are saying. What you don't want to do is you're post-launch and it's like not going really well, and like your customers don't really like you, you're not growing. That's a bad time to raise. That's like the trial of sorrow. So it's sort of like either do it before when it's like a dream and a vision and perfect, or after and like there's some like good signs basically.
Yeah.
A good question that came up was, what do you put exit strategy in the deck? And I sort of want to expand that to be like when people ask, what is your exit strategy? What have you answered, or what's a good answer? What's a bad answer? And obviously it should be authentic. I think, yeah, part of the 2 cents I want to give is like, you should actually think about what your actual exit strategy is, and make sure that it aligns with the investors that you're pitching. But yeah, I would love to hear what people answered and their tips on answering this question.
Personally, I think at seed, it's a little too early to talk about the exit already. So we did not put our exit strategy in there. And I don't think I will for sure not put an exit strategy into I've never put an exit strategy in my fundraising decks, and I'm not planning to in my next deck. I think when people talk about where do you want to take this, what's your personal ambition, that's something that's come up in the past, not just by investors, but also from candidates that I talk to. And there you should just talk about your honest personal ambition. Like, do you want to, just to be I think at least when candidates have asked me that, I've been transparent about where I want to take this company, and whether or not you want to IPO is something that only you can answer, I think.
There's also a lot of other paths too. I mean, I think like so early on, if you talk too much about an exit, I just think like they're not in it for the long haul. It takes 7 to 10 years to build like $1 billion company plus like something that's gonna last. And I'm like, man, you're just like a flipper and you just kind of go in and out. But like, I think the better question that I find myself asking is like, so how big can this get? Like, that's what like I get really excited about. I've never really asked that question of like, what's the exit strategy? I certainly have, as an investor in the back of my mind, have thought about like, and this is super, super non standard, right? Like, I think like for Angel, I've been like, well, I'll probably get my money back because it's going to be a profitable business kind of thing. But like, that's not thinking about on behalf of like YC and the fund, and that's like super, super rare. But I certainly think like it's much more about like the bigger vision than an exit strategy. Oh, but as a founder, when you're choosing your market, I've been surprised at how much things in life are about choosing. When you're choosing your market, I do think like looking at exit strategies, like looking at big exits or like how big it is, like gives you just more options. That's all. If you're sitting there thinking about like, hey, there's 3 or 4 markets I could go to, which one should I go into? If you have that choice, if you're like, no, this is what's burning inside of me, and this is like what I see, and this is such a huge market, and this is what it is, then okay, But as you get later, I think that question comes up more. But if it's early and the founders are already thinking about that, I just think, they just want to get acqui-hired, and this isn't really something I'm interested in. So that's me. I've never really asked that question at seed.
I definitely have gotten this question a lot, and I think that kind of similar to what I mentioned earlier. I think if you're pitching VCs, I think they do want to hear that you want to IPO, and so I think that if you don't, you probably shouldn't pitch institutional capital. Let me know if you guys disagree. But I think some angels are okay if you're like, I want to grow this to, you know, $10 million in revenue or $20 million in revenue, and then I want to sell it, and here's a bunch of people that could buy it. I think some angels could be interested in that, but most VCs would not be interested in that. So you should just maybe align who you're raising from if that's what you plan to do. But yeah, so when I've been asked the question, I say like I want to IPO, which is true, and then but I also allude to like people in the industry that could buy us, because I think people want to know that too. Like even though they want you to IPO, they also want to know that there's like some options if that doesn't happen. So I've been like, I want to IPO. Also, these are people that would be interested in buying us, but like we don't want to do that.
Aren't you like, I would say for you, Felicia, is your big elephant in the room because you're in gov tech. It's like, what happens to a company that sells to government? Like, I don't know if we see as many on IPO, right? Like maybe it's just a big elephant in the room. So which goes to show for everybody listening in that it just may not be a one size fits all. I could totally see actually now as a question for you early on, because like it's totally new to sell tech to government too.
Yeah, I don't know if everyone gets that, but I've gotten it. So
yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Felicia. Like first, as a founder, you should know what kind of business you want to build, and you should align your capital structure with what you want. But this question in particular, I think, is a know your audience kind of thing. Like there are angels who are like, I can't believe that you didn't talk about exit strategy. But for a venture fund, it can be a big red flag if at the seed stage you're already talking about who's going to buy you. In my mind, that translates to this person isn't in it for the long haul. And what I'm looking to fund are founders like Felicia who want to like go big or go home. So I think Felicia's answer is really good. The other thing I would add is that what an investor might be asking is, how would you be valued? So there's a big difference between a company being valued at 1x revenue or 10x revenue, and sort of knowing companies in your space and how they trade on the public markets could be a really useful thing to know. Knowing about transactions that have happened for comparable companies. So M&A, have there been any billion-dollar exits before? How big were those companies when they got acquired in terms of revenue? Those are just things to know and to be able to talk about around the conversation of exits. But if you're pitching a fund like First Round, I'd suggest not talking about exit strategy. Talk about how you could be a big sustainable company with lots of options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think to add to that, just really matching like where you want to take the company to and the capital structure. That is a very important point that I didn't really think about when I was first raising, because, you know, I think typically what we are exposed to the most is like, we just have to go to VCs and raise. But like Haley and Felicia's talking about, VCs typically are looking for that $1 billion exit. And if you don't actually want to build that kind of business, there are other alternatives that you can actually go for, like angels, family fund, like it doesn't have to be VCs. And so I think just kind of taking the time to think about that and not automatically going to VC, because that's the most typical route, could be very beneficial in the long run. Because where you don't want to be stuck is like, oh, now I want to do this thing, and then like already this VC is expecting something else is in your capital structure. So now what are you going to do?
Yeah, actually, I recently took a pitch from a founder where I saw a path to $1 billion business, and I was like, this is interesting. The founder's background is great. They have awesome traction. But they started talking about exit, and it was pretty clear that what the founder was aiming for was that there had been multiple like $50 million exits, like $20 to $50 million exits in her space. And that's what she was going to build for, and that's what she was going to play for. And I pushed her on it, and I was like, are you sure? Do you think if you had different investors or, a different amount of funding, would you want to go bigger? And she said, no. And I was like, okay, cool, sleep on it. Like if you change your mind and you like want to go bigger, we can continue this conversation. But if that's what you're playing for, I know it feels weird, but like I have to say no to founders that want to sell their company for 50 million, even if for them that could be,
life-changing amount of capital. For me, $50 million isn't a win, and it's weird to wrap your head around that, but that's the world, that institutional venture.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Like that's the type of capital, like the type of capital that venture seeks is like $1 billion exits. And there's definitely articles on the VC math, but there's, to Daewon's point, like if you want to build some other type of business where, I mean, which is a phenomenal business to be profitable, 50 million, you own 100% of the company, and it's this great business that sustains you and like 30, 40 people. Oh my God, like go for it. But then know that VC just isn't looking for that. They're looking for either the IPO or the $1 billion exit, because they've got a job to do.
Yeah. That makes sense. We got sort of a follow-up to this, which is if an investor asks you about like a market leader and asking if you'd be open to selling to them, is saying, no, I don't want to be acquired by them because I want to be a lot larger. Does that come across bad? I think kind of as everyone just alluded to, I think it's not bad to say that. I don't think it hurts to be like, no, we don't want to be bought by them. Like we want to be a lot bigger than them. I'm sure they would want to buy us, but we'd not be interested in that. And we're going to be bigger. Like, because again, I think it like investors want you to do the IPO, but they also want to be like, you have a couple backups if you fall a little short of that. So it doesn't hurt to like allude to that, but also not say that that's what you're shooting for. Okay. And then another question that came in was, how much detail should you go into in terms of your use of funds in the deck and in the pitch? So like, should you go into like a lot of detail? Like I'm hiring 3 backend developers, 1 in front end, like we're going to do this Facebook campaign, or should it be more general than that?
First, it depends on where you are in the conversation, but I'm always like, keep it super high level. And if they want to double click on it, then you give them more detail. Otherwise, like, I think it just gets so lost and you lose sight of the big vision. I'm a big fan of just keeping it super high level. Hey, we're looking for like 2 engineers and 1 salesperson. And we think that like we can increase our capacity of revenue and product features, which will increase revenue. And I'll be like, oh, okay, that's me. Maybe I would ask, maybe at a fund, it would be follow on later of like, hey, let me see some detailed kind of information on how you're going to spend it. I can imagine that when they're in their due diligence stage of like, hey, I'd love to see just a little bit more on your metrics or a little bit more on this. I think that's fine. But I'm always like, start out high level and then let them double click into anything.
Yeah, I think that's what I did for my pitch. Like hiring X and marketing X, like didn't really get into more details.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same here. So there's an overall allocation on R&D, an overall allocation on go-to-market. I also think you really don't want to start arguing about tactics. It gets like these things might change, and like there is no, sometimes like I would even say at that stage there is no right tactic. You might not even know just yet. So I wouldn't want to get too detailed. But if people, I think to tie it back to the earlier conversation, if people ask you like, how do you think about go-to-market, you should for sure have an answer for that. I just wouldn't list it in the deck under use of funds.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. So a few people have asked about being a solo founder and like, should they go ahead and pitch as a solo founder? Should they try to find a co-founder first? What are people's thoughts on that?
So I think being a solo founder, and everybody else can chime in because we probably have some various solo founders here. I think it's just, it's a little bit harder. It's like probably single parenting, I'd imagine. But usually solo founders find a team, like usually attend like, okay, they usually get help somewhere, but it is kind of nice to have probably a co-parent. I think you can go farther. Of course, I came from a co-founding team. I had probably too many, but that's okay. We all work well together. So I just don't think it would have gotten as big if it was just like 1 or 2 of us. We needed a builder. We needed somebody to fundraise. We needed like all of the pieces. So I certainly think that. And sometimes I will say this, like at YC, we've definitely funded like solo founders. There's no question about it. But there's usually, I'd say investors do like a preference for it, because one of the biggest things that I've noticed, even when like I do personal reference checks on founders for VC funds, they'll always ask like about leadership and recruiting ability. So that's one thing that they'll look at. So even if you're solo, what if you built a team? That's a great hack too. In some ways, it's like, hey, look at, and there's a ton of solo founders out there who have built like a great team, awesome leaders, and can recruit. But
I have a co-founder, but like personally, I think I'd rather be a solo founder than stuck with a co-founder that I found like last minute just to be able to please. So I wouldn't
absolutely. It's like getting married right away and having kids. Like, well, you don't want to just do that with anybody. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then I think what VCs are looking for much more than having a co-founder, is what are your abilities, what are your skills, and then what else are you lacking? How are you going to complement yourself with that? And then when I'd be just very upfront, like either you're an engineer and you're going to hire, you are aware that you lack, I don't know, business talent, and you're going to complement yourself with someone who knows how to do that, or you say you're non-technical, but you're aware and you're going to hire someone technical. I think if you're non-technical, it's a little more complicated, because at the beginning you do need an MVP, like something to show customers or potential future customers. So I would just have a good answer around like, how are you going to get your MVP? Who's going to build product early on?
I have co-founder, which is my sister. And I agree with Holly. Like, I have huge admiration for sole founder, because this is so freaking hard that I honestly would have given up a long time ago if I wasn't doing it with my sister. It's just, it's also more fun for me to actually like collaborate with Arun. And, you know, at the end of the day, like, if it's all grind and not fun, like what's the point? At least for me. So I think for that reason, co-foundership like really helped me. For fundraising though, I'm not really sure if it's like, I guess to Holly's point, they do prefer co-founders, but I don't know if it's like a huge factor. I did have to recruit CTO. Like when we first started, we didn't have a technical founder, and there was absolutely no way we would have raised as a tech company if we didn't have a CTO. So that I needed to do, and we started raising after we actually recruited a CTO. And actually for fundraising, we started going together, but I almost found it a little bit distracting, because like a lot of times they would ask questions, and then I would there were some times I was like, I don't really know how to answer this, and I'm not really sure like how she would answer it, like if she would agree with what I'm saying. So we actually started going together, but designated one person to speak and one person to answer, just because we didn't want to be telling conflicting stories, but we also wanted to get exposure as both founders to like the scene of pitching and whatnot, and educate ourselves. And so when we did go together, we actually said like, okay, you're going to talk and you're going to answer all the questions. Like, I'm only going to chime in if I need to, absolutely. But let's just have one person speak so that we're not saying like two different things. So we did that.
Hopefully this helps people feel more confident. I don't have any inherent bias against solo founders. It's just all about how you build the team around you and how you're aware of your skill set versus what you need to hire for. But like, don't worry about it.
I raised my pre-seed as a solo founder, and I think it was fine. I think it also depends if your company is like an extremely technical company, and you're not technical yourself, and you're a business person. I think that will be harder. My company, it was a tech company, but it wasn't like we were going to create some like patent and that was going to be the core of our thing. So, and I just talked about engineers I was talking to that were interested, and like, I think people were convinced that I would be able to bring someone on. So I would, like Laura said, like not let it hold you down. I personally had a hard time finding the right co-founder at first, and you know, then one of my best friends joined as my co-founder who was non-technical, and then she left during the pivot. And it's sort of like, just start, I don't know, the advice that I got was like, just start making progress and the right people will be attracted to what you're doing. and you don't want to like wait a year to start your company because you're looking for a co-founder. Like definitely if you want one, ask around and like try to meet people, but also like keep making progress. And there's a lot of people with ideas running around. And so if you can differentiate yourself being like, I have a first customer, like I cobbled together a prototype and like people are using it. And like just the more like progress you can make, the more attractive you'll be to like other co-founders to join you too.
Yeah.
Someone asked her like kind of a similar question, which is like, how do investors feel about founders that are related? So when you have a relation to your sister, and I know like there's some husband wife or like people that are partners that did team up. So what do people think about that?
Yeah, I'm actually really curious what Holly would say from investor perspective. I never got like, maybe they were being polite, but I never got like anyone who actually made that an issue. And in fact, sometimes I felt like it was a good thing because I know a lot of, at least in the very beginning, companies actually just, one of the main reasons why it just, doesn't, like companies fail, I guess, or stop existing is because the founders don't really know how to work together and they just give up because for whatever reason they don't trust and whatnot. And it can be a huge distraction for the company. And I think it was a relief for them to know that, like, yeah, we are actually working together with somebody that I've known for, 29 years. And there's like no way we're actually going to, just all of a sudden like stop, knowing how to work well together. And so in a way, it felt like it was a relief for the investor. So it kind of felt more like a pros and cons, or at a minimum, like no impact for when we fundraised.
Yeah, actually, not a lot of people know this, but I started with my cousin and 2 other friends, and it's funny because I wish I would have leaned into it and just be like, yeah, I co-founded the company with my cousin, and it was like this weird thing. My cousin actually didn't care; he was like the CEO, and so I'm a huge like. Thinking back, I'm totally fine with husband-wife teams. In fact, like I agree with you, day one, and like relatives, because there's ways in which that you trust your relatives in a way that like you would trust for nobody else. And it's like, there's really no way, like we're still related. Like I can't like not like break up. Like we're just kind of stuck together. The cool thing is we got along really well. And he was great to build a business with. I think there's also ways in which the trust goes so deep and there's ways in which you can resolve problems very fast, but then you're always going to resolve it in the same way. Let's put it that way. Because like it's just a ton of family baggage that comes up. Married might be a little different, but I know particularly at YC, we love it when founders know each other for quite some time, because there's just like a trust bank like that is built up over time. And as the company gets bigger, you take from that trust bank. And I'll be honest, there were so many ways where I took from the trust bank and it was just built up over time. Plus the other 2 were friends. So it's really, really nice to have that, because you're going to start, hopefully one day, many of you will be building these big businesses and these orgs where you hardly ever see each other because you're busy running like such a big business, and you just have to really trust that is going to happen. And that as you kind of grow, it's really strange how you see the culture in your business and how much it's almost like I always call it culture is almost like the baby of the co-founders. Like I just see wisps of like each of my co-founders in the org, especially the ones that stuck around for quite some time. We did have one leave a couple years in, but like I just kind of see wisps of even like how we interact kind of just flow in, even like some of the negative pieces as well. And I'm like, oh my God, what an amplifier on so many ways. So I'm like a huge fan of that. I don't mind husband and wife teams. That's me. But like some investors might have problems with it. At the seed stage, I know YC is totally fine with it. I mean, YC was started with a married couple. So they're like, we love it. We've funded brothers, we've funded sisters, cousins, whatever. It's because of that relationship and that trust.
I think I would just be transparent about whatever the relationship is. Like if you're married, just say it. If you're brother and sister, say it. Like I think that's the only part the transparency. You never want investors to find out something that's a surprise to them later.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool.
I can just add one thing. Like,
Yeah.
I really, ladies, like, fundraising is very it's nerve-wracking. It was definitely for me, and like I had millions of things that I kind of felt like I needed to worry, like, oh, the sister thing, and blah blah blah. Like, I wish I actually really knew. Yeah, it could be a factor, but really doesn't really matter. Like, having your story down and your like the problem solution, all that stuff that we talked about in the beginning, I would just almost think of all this, like, do I have to become a funder or whatever, like, don't even worry about that and just focus on that story, because that's what's going to carry the day. And like all these peripheral factors just is a distraction. Like, don't even worry about it.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Okay, there was a question about how do investors look upon finder's fees? For example, paying someone who makes introductions. My personal thought is this is very strange and you should run away from this and don't do it. That's typically not how the ecosystem works. Like, people make introductions, like other founders will make introductions for you because they want to be helpful, and because they think their investors might be interested, and investors that are investing in you should want to introduce you because they think they're helping someone get a good deal and to help you. And if someone's asking for a fee, it is strange and kind of shady, to be honest, is my take on it. What other people think?
I agree. That seems like a very non-Silicon Valley kind of thing, and might be an artifact of the ecosystem that you're building in. But that's huge red flag. Makes me think, like, what else does this founder need help with in order to grow their company? Like, you should be able to fundraise without that sort of professional assistance.
Yeah. Cool.
I completely agree. I think it's super shady. I think other founders, they will want to help you because like they've been in your shoes, and sending good deals to their investors actually makes them look good in front of their investors. They also probably like their investors, hopefully, and want to help them out. I also think investors look at your way of getting introduced just as an indicator of how good you are at networking, how good you are at getting people to help you out. And if you can't get any introductions at all, like when I just got to San Francisco, I'm from Germany, so I didn't have any friends or connections here. I wrote a whole lot of cold emails as well, and a few of them got responses. And I think that's also a completely fine way to get creative, just writing some cold emails that are very targeted, not spamming people, but just very targeted why this investor should care.
Awesome. Okay, this question has come up a few times. What about founders that are part-time, maybe like they're working at their job, but they want to raise money to start the thing, and maybe they don't have funding to sort of quit their job before they've raised money? Do you have any thoughts on sort of if that's possible to do, if investors, would think that was strange at all? My quick thought is, like, you don't actually have to, I mean, if someone asks, you can bring it up, but it doesn't even typically come up in the conversation. And obviously, if it comes up, be honest about it. But a lot of times when you're pitching, like, this is what I'm doing, I don't know. I think it's hard to do part-time because we've talked about in the process one last time that, like, it's kind of a full-time job. So I think it would be very hard to do on nights and weekends. But if you have to, then I think it's fine.
I think it's totally fine if you're like, as soon as we raise funding, this person is going to be full-time. Like, there's the realities of being able to pay your expenses. But I think both these questions get at the idea of messy cap tables, and making sure that the ownership of your company before a fundraising round just like makes sense and is aligned going forward. So red flags would be if there's like past co-founders that have left that still have a bunch of equity, or if there's been prior investment rounds where maybe investors have taken advantage, and that the founders, even before they've raised a seed round, own, let's say, like
less than half of their company, like that's something that needs to be fixed. But yeah, not everyone can work full-time at a business before money is raised, and it's totally fine.
So I think it's going to be, it's a little difficult if you're going for seed capital to be part-time and still working on it, even sometimes pre-seed. It has to be super clear. Like usually you have some special skill or some team that's set up. And then it's like, okay, once I get this, I will quit. The hard thing is if you're sitting there saying, I'm going to work on this on the side until I get some traction and then raise money and then never quit. That is really hard for an investor.
I thought it was like pre-fundraising.
Yeah. I mean, like if you're looking for seed, if you've been working on it for now and you're going to try to find $1 million and you've been working on it part-time, it's going to be hard. I think even at the YC stage, we ask you to commit like full time. And I think that is pretty, because then we put you in front of investors like Haley and them, and I definitely wouldn't want them to invest in part-time founders, because partly like, look how far you can go if you had like more time. And obviously YC is there to give like the $150K. And we've had people who are like, hadn't left their jobs yet, and certainly have like said, like, it's not a good answer of like, hey, if you don't get funded, what are you going to do? You don't say, I'm going to stop working on this. You're going to be like, I'm going to keep on working on this, right? That's the right answer. The raw, like usually when we see part-time founders, we're like, what is it going to take for you to leave your job and say, this is the thing I want to do for the rest of my life? And sometimes if it's just funding, it's pretty, like if it's funding because they have to like work, right? Because there's some other expenses, and that's different. But if it's just kind of like, oh, it's a signal, because some founders will use it as a signal that they should be doing this, that like, oh my God, somebody else believes in me. You have to believe in yourself stronger than us as an investor believing in you. That's where it's like kind of problematic.
I do think there's some good question about just like, how are you going to survive if you don't have money? And I think my story is, when we started working on this, I dropped out of grad school to work on this. So I had no personal savings from any previous jobs. But instead of raising a seed round, you can go out. Like we went out, raised a tiny check, just $25,000. It let us survive for, I think, 9 months or something, moved to a cheaper place. We moved to San Jose instead of San Francisco. Both of my co-founder and I just like lived in the same house, worked out of the same house for 6 months, 9 months, and we built an MVP, and then we're able to fundraise. So I think fundraising, you don't need to go out and raise a seed from day one. You can get a little bit of angel money, whatever it takes to survive 3 months, 6 months to be able to show progress for a next investor.
Yeah. That's, I mean, hearing that story, Laura, like that even inspires me, right? Like, oh, wow, this like founder is like so vested in this, like so believe in this. Like, I think that point is like, you want to really actually want to be able to show that. And I think that's huge. That goes really far. Just as a data point, I did actually have one co-founder. We had 3 co-founders, and one of them actually was part-time before we fundraised. And so that wasn't a problem. And like kind of what Phyllis just said, that didn't come up. There were 2 of us who was full-time and then 1 part-time. So it wasn't a problem for me at that time. So I think it couldn't just vary.
Awesome. One question came up, kind of a tactical thing. How do investors feel about a founder using their name in another meeting to build a feeling of buzz? For example, I just had a great meeting with XVC and we're diving deeper into diligence. Is this seen as tacky, not being discreet, or is it common practice?
I think you should avoid it. I think it is way more likely to backfire than to be helpful. I think it was said earlier, I forget who said it, that like you should never invoke the name of an investor or be introduced by an investor who hasn't already invested. Because probably the first thing someone's going to do is like, oh, you met with Haley, let me email her. And they're going to email me and I'll be like, I took 1 meeting. I have no clue if I'm going to invest yet. And it just makes you look like you're overselling.
I do think it is fine to be talking in generalities without specifics about the fact that you have other funds that are moving forward in the process, and be communicating with each investor about timelines and the competitive nature of the round. I think that is in your favor, but don't name names ever.
I agree with that. Like Haley said, I think unless they've like committed, then you can like start using their name everywhere. But if they haven't, then I agree completely.
Yeah.
And to make everyone feel better about this, I made that mistake during my seed round. So that's why I say it so strongly. I thought it was like, oh, aren't you all friends? And if it's like, if they like us, isn't that good? But it actually ended up meaning that we actually got like 2 identical term sheets, because I think there was collusion that they like talked to each other before they priced the first round.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question. What would it be a good idea to have a vesting schedule in place right before you start fundraising, which would indicate that every founder, even the part-time ones, intend to stay with the company long term?
Yeah, I think it is just good corporate governance, even if you don't plan to take any outside capital, for you to have founder vesting. It ensures that, you know, whether it's someone gets hit by a bus or circumstances change, that there aren't people who aren't aligned or not actively working towards the company who have significant ownership stakes. So the typical vesting schedule would be, you know, for a 4-year vesting schedule.
Yeah,
just everyone has that.
4-year with one cliff, so at like a 1-year cliff, so at the 1 year.
For founders, I don't know if there needs to be a cliff. I think that's sort of a judgment call.
I did something kind of unconventional, which is I did 8-year vesting for founders, like including myself, and I'm glad that I did, because my first co-founder left during a pivot kind of early, and I did it because I was like, I'm really in this for the long term, and I really like this co-founder that's joining, but like if someone leaves 3 years in, that's actually not very long for founders, and like I've never heard of anyone else doing it, so but I'm like really happy that I did, so I like mentioning it just because you can kind of, for employees, you pretty much do 4-year with 1-year cliff, but for founders, like I personally like doing longer, and it's slightly bad for me because like I'm investing over a longer period, but I'm okay with it because I didn't intend to like sell, and you can also have like a clause that you would accelerate your vesting if you sold anyway. So I don't know, just something to consider.
Well,
So smart. I think, like, I mean, I just, even among my friends, ran into so many situations where founders leave like 3 years, like honestly nothing, and they vested almost fully and they left, and like all these other founders are like staying on to like work really hard to build a company, when, you know, at that point really it's like, yeah, it could be valued at a certain point, but you really need so much work ahead to actually realize that. But then they have now this huge like founder who left to get a huge part of their cap table. So that is so common. I think it's really smart that you did that. And I also know that now, like a lot of my founder friends are like a repeat, and then now they're on their second and third. They actually even have like almost like a prenup, separation agreement or something, where like depending on the revenue size of the company, so how quickly you actually built it, you know, they actually have some clause, like you don't want to make it too complicated, but there are some creative things that you can actually put in place and not just follow the standard. And I wish I kind of knew that going in. And yes, I guess to go back to the original question, I was advised actually from the lawyer that my counsel that we were working with, to put in the vesting schedule as soon as possible, because the investor, when they come in, they will actually ask for it. And if you don't have it, they're going to make it start like then. But if you already have it, you already started vesting. So I think for that reason, I'm glad that I actually had put in the vesting schedule as soon as like we incorporated.
I agree just as a heads up, like if you're almost fully vested, let's just say that you haven't raised your seed round and you've been working on the company for 3 years, it might be reset anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, investors, like you're saying, if they won't want you to just have 1 year left if they're investing. Cool. And there was a follow-up to Laura's anecdote about raising 25K, which was, I also would like to raise 25, 50K to get the product out. Would you recommend doing that on a safe with an angel?
Yeah, I think angel investors are perfect for that. Safe is a great format for that. So I think that's awesome. I think with angel investors, they're investing smaller check sizes. They're okay with smaller outcomes. They're not institutional investors. It's more about a personal connection that you might have with that person, whether or not they like your idea, how much they're like, if they have any personal like stories or connections to that idea, to the kind of company you're building. So it's more of a leap of faith, less of data that you need to show.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And someone's asking about how much to pay founders and co-founders. We kind of dug into that a decent amount in the last session, so I'm going to send out the video if you missed that part, and you can listen in on that. Someone else asked, how do you raise if you are in the trial of sorrow? So we kind of said like, okay, raise before you launch or like after and it's going well, but what if you launched and it's like not going super well? Do you have tips on raising during that period? It's a tough one. Yeah.
It is to be avoided. That's definitely the toughest time to raise. If you have raised a small amount and you do have existing investors on the cap table, you might be able to get an extension. So like put together a plan to restart momentum that has a much smaller price tag on it. And get your existing investors to realize like if they don't put a little bit more gas in the tank, this is probably going to go to zero. But yeah, that's the scenario where you already have investors who are behind you. If you if you don't have investors yet, or you're just bootstrapped, I think like figure out what you can do to jumpstart momentum, or like recut your traction to sort of like make it not seem like a trough of sorrow.
Yeah, I agree, because even if you actually do end up raising at that point, because if the things are not looking good, then valuation is not going to be good, and like you may end up having to give up like a lot more of the equity than you were originally planning, and like it's going to be painful. Like I wish I actually protected my equity like there was no tomorrow, when in the beginning I just didn't realize, and so how much I should actually fight for it. And it's like a lesson that I really want to share. Of course, at the end of the day, your company is surviving, and that is the most important thing. But if you're in that situation, if you can, try to like get it together by some other means before having to go to somebody like institution investor, because you're going to have to give up a lot more of your equity.
And the positive part is, or the optimistic side, like everyone's probably gone through that hard phase. We have gone through that hard phase, so you're not the only one. Yeah. We did exactly what Haley said when we were in that hard phase. Like when we had to fundraise or running out of money, we told our the story. What happened was like getting ready to fundraise, had our pitch deck, started talking to a few investors. And then it turns out that our largest customer churned, and it was unpredicted, didn't know, just churned at the wrong time. And it was just a terrible time to fundraise. So we went back to our existing investors who were in the know, like, of course they know what was going on. We're having very good relationships with them. And then they had trust that we were able to recover from that. They gave us an extension. And then 6 months later, we went out and raised a very good round of financing.
Those are really good suggestions. And yeah, I think like I agree with what everyone said, and like just kind of along the lines of recutting your traction, just like look for what are the glimmers of hope, even if it's not all going well. Like, are there some customers that love you and you're about to do this and that will change? Like, I think investors will want to invest if like there's something coming that like you're about to do this and that's going to change things.
Yeah. I think like I'm sorry I was vague about that, but it's like your investors didn't know what your plans were 6 months ago. Like if you're meeting me for the first time and all you're telling me is about how you have this one customer who is head over heels obsessed, I don't need to know that your plan had actually been to have 10 customers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean by sort of like refocusing and like telling the story in a different way.
Great. That makes sense. Okay, awesome. And then a few people have asked about NDAs. So either investors signing NDAs or early people on your team signing them. Those are
investors rarely sign NDAs. That's why if it's your secret sauce, like I usually say, if it's like your Coke and it's your trade secret, do not share it in a pitch, anything that can be forwarded. And then in pitch meetings, I'm kind of like, hey, if you could talk about it in a way where it can't be replicated, then that's great. So NDAs, like I don't know any investor that will sign one, so I wouldn't really bother. I certainly think like candidates and like people like that, they'll sign it. And no, but NDAs are hardly enforceable, particularly in California.
I think the general attitude that I hear among investors is that it's all about execution anyway. Like unless as Holly said, there's anything that's absolutely secret, it's probably about execution, and then it's talking about it with other people. You might get a few good ideas, you might get introductions, and rather just talk to people about it and trust that I will execute than keeping it secret.
Yeah, I agree with that for investors. And for employees, it's very common to have NDAs in your employment agreement. Like you should get a lawyer and have like a standard employment agreement, and it'll typically include like confidentiality type of stuff in there. So you should include that.
But you must have that with your employee.
Yeah, you have to have that. Okay. So someone else asked what to include on the team slide when you're pitching about your team. So who, like, should you include yourself? Let it be like freelancers or like part-time team members? Like who should be on the team slide, and how should you talk about your team?
So I personally enjoy founders. That's like my main thing, is like who are the engines behind this. Not a big fan of showing like advisors, part-time. I know people like to like spruce it up, but it's fine if you tell me that, but advisors are just not going to be the ones that are driving it. Part-time people aren't going to be the ones that are driving it. I mean, maybe if you have like a couple engineers that are full-time on your team that like have PhDs in text mining and that's what you're doing, or was like a rock star somewhere else, like that's really well known, then yeah, I'd probably put them on there. Like if it's something that's like to your core competency on why you're going to win, stick it on there. Advisors, I'm always like a little bit, because I feel like you are the core competency, you and the co-founders are. So I definitely want to see that. But the other ones, I'm just kind of like, once they stack it with too many advisors, I'm like, what are they hiding? Part-time people are just the same as advisors in my mind. I don't really know how helpful they are.
Yeah, I only included, when I raised, we were 4 people, the 3 co-founders and my CTO. So we included the entire team. We included like mainly our work experiences that's relevant to call out. Like, for example, like, my CTO worked at Amazon, like built and, like led and managed this amount of team and built this, like those kind of things that I knew was going to be relevant to building CMB, I included it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. Let's see. Okay, there was a question about how much research to do on investors beforehand. Like, so I guess like how much research to do, and I guess how much to share that you've done that research when you're talking to the investors.
I'm a huge fan of doing a little bit of research for the founder. One, it's very hard to get people off the cap table. It's very hard, like reversing cap table decisions are probably one of the most difficult things. I would rather, as a founder, I'd rather have a failed fundraise than clean up like a messy table, because I can figure out how to survive on less cash, but like getting rid of like an annoying investor or something like that's just, it's really, really difficult. So yes, I would do some research. I would also do, also when you go to them, which is really great, if you do some research on them, like make them feel loved, right? Make them feel like there are some, like, make them feel like, oh my gosh, I would love to have you on the cap table. I see that you did X, Y, and Z. You would be so incredibly helpful, especially their angels are probably writing anywhere from a 10K check to even some super angels write 100K. Like, yeah, they're individuals. You should certainly try to prioritize this. If you have a choice, prioritize the strategic ones. If you don't, then it's a little bit harder, but absolutely I wouldn't put any back. I always tell people, everybody on your cap table should be a net positive. And there are still some bad actors out there who are trying to invest in female founders. And I tell female founders, I'm like, they're likely not going to be a net positive on your cap table. So just think about that and just be kind of wary. And there is money out there. I know we hear all these stats of how terrible things are, but like there is money out there and there is good money out there for you.
I think you should know like the basics of the investor strategy, and what they've invested in before, but like I don't need you to stroke my ego. Like I'm there to learn about you and your business. So sometimes I'm actually off-put by people who are like too obsequious about that. And I think there's another important, you probably talked about this during at the process conversation, but once you get a yes from investor, then again, that's when the tables turn and you start asking a lot of questions and you can figure out like the bad actor stuff that Holly's figuring out. Like don't go too crazy trying to do back channel references or things for the first meeting, but definitely you should be doing references and thinking carefully about anyone that you add once you have a yes from them.
Completely agree with that. I think the other thing that's important is, like we talked earlier about looking into if the firm is a fit. It's not just about whether the firm is a fit, but like if the partner at that firm is a fit for you, if that partner knows your space. So at firms, there are multiple partners. They specialize in different things. If you're a consumer startup, find the consumer focused partner. If you're a B2B startup, go for the B2B partner. And I'm overly generalizing at this point. But and then to your point, Haley, like I've had people reach out to me that were like, we're talking to Jeremy at Bessemer. Can you talk to me? Can you like give me a reference? And of course I text Jeremy, and then Jeremy's like, oh, I've only met them once. Like, what's going on? And that's I think that's then a bad signal. It sends a signal to Jeremy that the founder is not aware where they are in the stage of the fundraise. Yeah, but I would say there is the other thing is like, I guess it goes without saying, but just like I've had people meet me, and I'm not like an institutional investor or anything like that, but I've had candidates meet me that like reference, I don't know, my Strava profile, like how much I run. And I'm like extremely creeped out by that. Don't do that, right? But then if you realize that you went to the same school or you came from the same town, like it comes up naturally in conversation. You can engineer that to come up, and that's a great personal connection to have.
Yeah. I agree. I think some research is good, like the school thing, like just, their theses like we're all humans, right? And it is very flattering. I mean, I actually I'm sure you guys have heard like dating analogy with fundraising, like
Totally.
It's flattering to actually know that like, oh yeah, you actually know that I invested in this thing and like I'm knowledgeable in this area. And you can do that without actually coming across like so needy, right? It's flattering, but like, you know what, if you don't want to invest, I'm fine too, because I have a gazillion other people that I can talk to, kind of way. And so I think that's good. It is also important to, I think another reason why research is important is because it also like helps you not waste time. And so we talked a little bit about like different stages. Like there are just certain people who just don't invest in certain stage, or there are certain people who just don't know the industry enough to be able to make an investment. And so I think like to avoid wasting your time, doing some research on that is important. That's why I think even meeting the right partner, like Laura said, yeah, the farm is good, but if you're talking to the wrong partner, then it's maybe a waste of time. That's why it's good to actually look up what the partner actually typically invest in and what their expertise are.
Yeah. And my advice was really around chasing particular angels, because it's like chasing high net worth individuals. And usually even like when universities try to do development or get donations and fundraise, they definitely like try to match make what are their interests, what is it that they've been looking for. But I absolutely agree with like Haley and everybody else when they're like on a fund and you're representing a fund, you should kind of see what they've invested in the past. But maybe at YC it's not quite swayed. We've invested in everything, and when founders are like really bullish on something, sometimes it can be a little bit like, wow, are they paying attention? Is this becoming a discussion? Like the best kind of meetings are like it becomes a discussion and the investor is getting excited and they're telling you all these other ideas and they're getting really involved and they're helping you paint this vision. And it could be very much like that's what you were trying to say, but they pretend they came up with it themselves, and that's totally fine too. Like that's okay. It just means that they're engaged, and those are like the very best meetings. You're like, oh my God, what a great date.
I actually want to interject with a bit of a pet peeve and something that I've seen come up in the chat. And I know this is all about like honesty, so hopefully this is okay, Felicia. I've seen the idea of like being a female founder, or people who want to invest in female founders come up a few times in the chatter. And this is something that I think is not to your advantage. I think you are a founder and the value is your company. And I think your gender doesn't matter that much. And also the gender of the investor doesn't matter that much. And so when I get intro requests to a founder where it's like, there's a female founder who would really like to meet with you, it actually turns me off a little bit that they think gender alone is the reason that there would be the right fit. And I'm saying that as someone who has invested in a lot of female founders, and it's a big reason why I do my job. I just think it's sort of like the hierarchy of like how you identify and why you're seeking capital or trying to meet an investor match. It shouldn't be about gender. That's my 2 cents. And I'm sorry, I just had to put it out there, especially given that we have like 230 female founders on here. I want to just mention it as a potential red flag.
Totally with you. I think VCs, like it's in the name, they're capitalists. They care about you making money. It doesn't matter what gender you are.
Well, having said that, there are actually investors who do actually specifically look out for female investors because they actually really want to, change the ecosystem. And I think, absolutely, like we should go for those investors. Like,
yeah, but like when they meet you or they see your LinkedIn profile, like, I don't know, I feel like it doesn't have to be in the subject line of the email or anything that's right, but like it should be that you're like a consumer social founder or an amazing enterprise, like B2B visionary. Like, shouldn't that be the like headline? And then like they'll meet you and it'll be like, this is an awesome woman that I like can't wait to back. And like, yes, there's gender is a factor. I don't like it as like the reason.
But there are funds who have strategically said that this is what they go after, and I think it's fine for those the founders to like go after like the female founder fund. That's exactly what they invest in, because they do think that there is this. To Megan's point in the chat, she's like, let's acknowledge that there's a general disparity about the opportunities. But you're absolutely right. It's not the only thing. Like you got to build a business. There's so many things, but people are like, there are funds out there that specifically look for female founders with phenomenal businesses, that I do think that it's okay to play that up. I think what Haley's saying is like, it's not just because Haley's a female investor that I'm going to suddenly fund you because you're a female founder. I don't mean to put that in your mouth, but like, but I do want to acknowledge that there are funds for that. And I do want to acknowledge that there is some way to navigate this. I mean, we aren't men, and it's not everything that if we behave exactly like men, it may not always come off the same way. I'm gonna have a female dominated.
I completely agree with
Oh yeah, female dominated cap table. That's a good way to diversify. A lot of people are doing that. Sorry, go ahead, Felicia.
No, you're good.
This is a great discussion.
It is a good topic. I agree with everything everybody said, and I think that like a good way to sort of maybe thread it, adding to what Haley said, is maybe like if I were gonna pitch Haley, I wouldn't be like, I'm so happy that you're a female VC and like excited to get to pitch you. Like that might just come across strange, but it might be okay to be like, you know, I was inspired, like when you were founding your company, it like encouraged me to start my company because I could see someone who looked like me, or like you can make some, you know, allusion to that, or you know, if you saw her in this boot camp, you can mention that. Like you can make some connection that like, oh, it's cool that you're supporting female founders without being like, this is the reason that, you know, that we should work together. There's been a few questions about how much equity to give angels and like valuation, but we actually spent a bunch of time on that in the last session, so I'm not going to address those, but definitely go back and watch that discussion. Then there were a few questions about in-person versus video versus phone. I know there's quite a few founders that are not in the Bay Area or not in New York where there's huge concentration of investors, so if you're kind of like in other parts of the country or the world, this is particularly relevant. So what are people's thoughts on in-person versus video versus phone, either for the first meeting or like later on meetings?
I'm a huge fan if you can get them in person, to get them in person for the first meeting. But if like the next is video call and then a call, that's me. That's my big thing. And I'm assuming it's like angels and seed funds, but yeah, that would be my preference as a founder. To highest conversion, right? It's harder, yeah.
For me, in the early meetings, definitely before the investment happens, you want to meet. I haven't found that much difference between video and in person. So I just did either, whatever was possible. And then, but definitely not, I think actually being able to see people face to face does make a huge difference. And you know, if you're doing the video, like really make sure that, actually, you know what? I take that back. I agree with Holly, because I also had some occasions where I'm not, like I was doing video and like it was clear the other person was very distracted with something else, which actually never happens when you're in person. So I think if you can do in person, do in person.
I think you also want to see that other person in person if possible. And it's about like early on establishing a connection, and it's about like body language, how well you get along, how well the conversation flows. Just so much easier to pick up on these cues if you can see the person.
It's definitely not necessary though. So for anyone who's like freaking out about how often they're gonna have to get on planes to make this happen, you know, I think it's increasingly easy with tools like Zoom to be able to build a rapport and even make an investment decision without meeting face to face. But it's probably in your best interest to figure out how to run a process such that you can be in New York for a few days or in San Francisco for a few days, such that you can meet a high number of investors per airline ticket you have to get.
That makes sense. Okay. And then a few people asked, and then plus one question of what are good questions to ask investors at the end of the meeting, like when, you know, kind of turning the table and asking them a few questions.
Oh, I have some, but I don't know if it was done in the last session. Sorry, let me turn on my video. Like, can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So some of them is usually like, what's your normal process? How many other founders have you invested in the last 12 months? You know, can I talk to them? Maybe one or two of them. It could be something, especially after if they haven't invested, I wouldn't say, can I talk to them? But And then definitely ask like, what's their typical check size, and kind of like get around like check size, process, and like, have they actually written checks in the last 12 months? If the answer is 0, the likelihood of converting them to write a check for you is just much harder, I think. So those are kind of like the 3 questions I like asking. And then at the end of the meeting, I always have a next step. So if they answer about like the process and say, you know what, I need to go back and talk to my partner, and I'll get back to you in 2 or 3 days. They'll be like, great. If I don't hear from you from then, I'll send you a note. Or you can also evoke some type of urgency. It's like, yeah, that would be great if you can move a little bit sooner, because I have some back-to-back meetings. The round's kind of getting filled. So you can kind of push it a little bit. But those are generally, I think, some 3 really good questions to ask. Again, I don't know if you covered this in process last time.
Not as much. Yeah, I think that's great. Okay, awesome. Another question that came up is, what are people's thoughts on accelerators? Like, do you recommend that people join accelerators? Obviously, Holly is at YC, so you might be a little biased, but.
I didn't do an accelerator, and I wish I did, because like when I speak to my founder friends who are in YC or other accelerator, it's like really nice to have the cohort of people to actually like bounce around ideas with and ask for stuff, because you guys are we're all going through the same thing. And, you know, a lot of questions we're covering here, right? Everybody has to go through that. And then also, you know, like they also have a lot of programs where they recruit people, share best practices. So I think it seems like it's very valuable, even though I didn't go through it. So I wish I did.
Well, I don't know. I'm very curious about Laura and Felicia, because so our company, we didn't go through it, and this is why I'm like super fascinated. We started our company in 2006 when YC wasn't quite around, and it's very fascinating. I agree with you, Daewoo, that like there is like a community, because it's very rare that founders. So I do think founders tend to help out other founders very quickly. I think it's part of misery loves company, and it's very rare that we'll be kind of competitive with one another. So I'm always very happy to share like things that we've learned on, like, it's almost like parenting, and I apologize for anybody who doesn't have kids, but it's like you're constantly sharing these tips on like, should I do this or should I do that? Or even if you've trained a dog or taken care of anything alive, there's different ways of like training and doing that, and there's so many ways where everything's very similar. So I certainly think YC has been really wonderful around that. They've also been super helpful, I think, on fundraising, because they've created this demo day thing. But I remember somebody asked me like if we would have taken the company through like an accelerator, and I was like, well, I have no idea. This is before I came to YC. I'm like, if they taught me like the important stuff, like hiring and firing and interviewing, like maybe. And they don't really teach that. They actually teach you how to talk about your company, how to get to product market fit. And most companies, I'll be honest, at the end of YC don't even have product market fit, but they help you think about your business and what it takes to get to the kind of the next stage. And then they help you with fundraising, because it's partly the brand. And I'm more than happy to chat more with anybody who's interested in YC. Sorry, I don't want to make it a commercial, but I'll share my email if people want to know more. But like, I'm curious as to like the other founders and how they feel, because I feel like Laura and Felicia, you guys were born in a way where accelerators did happen. Like, I feel like me and Daewoo are of a more tenured generation. So yeah, very curious how you guys feel.
I think if you can do YC for sure. We applied, we didn't get in. So I would have wanted to do YC.
It's like, that's the thing, is like, we've missed in the past. So
Yeah, so don't feel bad if you don't get in, because Laura's company is amazing. So.
It's not, it's not, yeah. And that's what I also want to encourage people, is like, you could still build it like a massive business if like I said, YC has failed in the past before too. Or like you'll just see more and more, I don't know, just over time. It's a numbers game, right? But absolutely, please feel free to apply for YC. I'm more than happy to chat.
I think the upside of an accelerator, like there are a few accelerators, I guess, that are really good. YC is one of them. I think Techstars is another. I think so. It's not just YC. There are a few, and I think they just give you a great brand. Like you attach yourself, you at that stage, if the company don't have your own brand yet and your company doesn't have a brand, but YC has one, and you attach yourself to YC's brand, gives you credibility, it opens doors. It like they put you in front of a bunch of investors who are all eager because you've been pre-screened by the accelerator people. So I think, yeah, overall it's awesome. I would do it. If
it's also super helpful for you because you came from Germany, right? Your network in the US. So it's like a great way if you don't have networks here. But sometimes, like, I think some people already have networks here. Like Felicia, I think you had some really great networks before you started your business. But I don't mean to put words in your mouth. But you could also argue the other side of why not to do it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So so someone asked, will
you didn't want to answer that, Felicia?
Oh no, I mean I did. I think no, I've heard amazing things about accelerators, so I agree that I think they could be really helpful. But yeah, we didn't do one, and I think you can go either way. I mean, they do take a decent amount of equity. I think YC takes like 7%, which is like kind of a lot for the amount of money that they give too. So it's just like a consideration. But I think a lot of people find it worth it.
I'll tell you what you get for your 7%. I'll be honest, I think, Felicia, you had some really great networks in terms of her fundraising. So it is there to help also fundraise, to think and talk about, communicate about your company in a way that honestly investors would understand, because you guys will know your business the best. We'll know investors just a little bit more.
Awesome. So someone asked about like the recordings. So the June bootcamp, we did record everything, and I've sent them out over email. The first 3, we're going to send out the 4th one before next week. And we're also recording these. We haven't sent them out just because I need to like upload them to somewhere and share them, but I'm planning to do that in the coming days. So if you missed one or if you came late today, I will be sharing that shortly. So we are at time. There's still some more questions, but we tried to get through a lot of the ones that got asked frequently. I do want to share that next week will be the last of the 4 weeks, and we're going to be covering how to close investors and how to handle the follow-ups after the meeting. So now you've pitched and now you're sort of following up over email, or sort of like getting to the last meeting, or like the whole process after the meeting. And then also how to handle the emotions of fundraising, because it is an emotional roller coaster, and so tactics and thoughts on dealing with that, and then how to think about if you want to announce your round or not in terms of press. So that's what we'll be covering in the last session. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing all of your insights. It's super valuable, and I think hopefully it's helping a lot of women sort of like get up to speed really quickly and get a head start going into their first raise. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Felicia, for doing this. It's so incredible. It's like, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicia.
Thank you. Bye. Good night, everyone.
Bye.